Phoenix Gray, and welcome to LitRPG Happy Hour, where I sample LitRPG and alcoholic beverages. Feel free to drink along if you dare. At Justin Lincoln's request, today is going to be a special double feature. I'm going to start by reading a sample of Eloria's Beginning into the Louvre, Book 1 by Tom Hansen, and I'll be playing Character Attack along with it. With this game, I'll take a drink every time a character attacks a monster. Once I finish the sample, I'll switch over to Justin Lincoln's Martyrs, Legends of the Great Savannah. And with that book, I'm going to be playing Character Shit-Faced, where I'll take a drink every time a character sheet is displayed. If you want to follow along, pause this video and download a copy of the book samples at the links below, or you can just take a drink whenever I do. As disclaimer, I do not read every book that I drink to. This is all for fun and to help spread the word about LitRPG and these awesome books. Having said that, let's get started. So today I'm actually drinking a Snowdrift Vanilla Porter, and I probably will not finish it because I'm doing two books. I'm going to stick with beer because otherwise I would not make it through this reading. It's probably going to be a very long reading. So anyway, let's get started. Prologue. Adriana Brzezinski, that was a hard one to say, was getting coffee when the artificial intelligence hijacked her computer. Instead of being out at a bar with her friends, she was stuck in a cramped cubicle 100 meters underground. Fluorescent lights flickered in the hall, giving her a headache and reminding her just how lonely it was to be at work on a Friday night. Worse yet, she was out of coffee. Her cubicle was in Switzerland, but the coffee machine was all the way in France, out the door and down the hall. In the distance, the sounds of the automatic vacuums began their evening dance around the chilly office space. By all rights, she had a pretty cool job programming for the largest company in the world. Epic International had hired her straight out of college, and her top-secret job at CRN was both challenging and rewarding. She glanced at the clock, 22 minutes until 7. Once she made sure the compile went through for tomorrow's testing, she would be free. She sighed. Still too early to try to bail. Her supervisor, Sven, who never seemed to go home, would be at his desk, slaving away for his corporate masters. As much as she wanted to leave, she couldn't disappoint him. She got back to poring through the day's code. The game had been in production for a scant 6 months, and the AI that wrote it revolutionized the gaming industry as the first game written entirely by a computer program. AI-written code, while efficient, wasn't perfect, and her team's main job was to spot-check the daily code to make sure it kept within parameters. She should get business cards. Adriana, AI Wrangler Extraordinaire. She furrowed her brow and squinted at the latest name change. The AI named Lasses, man, these are really hard for me to pronounce, thought itself hilarious at its own wordplay, and this time had named the game the Louvre Adventure Reticulation Protocol. Lasses did stuff like this all the time. It would dig up some human phrase or meme and sift through its database of written language to come up with something it found fun and unique. She couldn't help but smirk at this title, like the AI had planted it there just for her. The acronym spelled out LARP, referring to live-action roleplay. On some level, she appreciated its dry wit, even if it made her life harder. LARPing. It was a bunch of lame, girlfriendless losers dressed up in cardboard armor on the weekends and beating each other with wooden swords. Tabbing to another window, she messaged her supervisor. Abrzezinski. It changed the game's name again. Stellan. Oh, great. What did he come up with now? Abrzezinski. The Louvre Adventure Reticulation Protocol. Stellan. Stellan. At least this one's in English. Wasn't the last one in Portuguese? Abrzezinski. Ancient Greek. The one before that was Hmong, then Portuguese. Stellan. Whatever happened to Eloria Online? It's the best one he's given us to date. Marketing meets next week to finalize the name and prepare for launch. We can worry about it then. Stellan. Can you shorten it to the Louvre Adventure? Hopefully he won't change the name for a few more weeks. Abrzezinski. K. Adriana changed the name to the Louvre Adventure, then glanced at the clock again. 15 minutes until 7. Her eyes widened and a wicked smile crossed her lips. If she began compiling now, it should be done by the time her shift was over. She could go change for the club and grab some coffee from France before heading out. Shouldering the backpack from under her desk, she leaned over her keyboard and sent the code to compile, grabbed her coffee mug, and headed down the hallway. 10 minutes later, she sauntered back to her desk wearing a mini skirt, heels, and a crop top, her business attire stuffed into the backpack dangling from her slender arm. Her long black hair done up in a clip would need to be fixed on the road. She placed her coffee on her desk and tossed the backpack beside her chair. Her phone buzzed. It was Dorothy, waiting outside her office. She swore at the phone. Don't you know that people have jobs? Chill, okay? She picked up and sent, "Be right there, 5 minutes," and hit the lock button on her phone. Dorothy replied, but Adriana ignored the buzzing and took a long draw of dark coffee. Overhead, the fluorescent lights blinked, reminding her of the headache at the edge of her consciousness. The damned light had been doing that more and more lately. No one else in the office complained, and of course it never happened when maintenance was around to notice. She would submit another maintenance request on Monday. Hopefully it would blink for them this time. Her phone buzzed again. "Jesus, Dor, keep your dress on." Adriana didn't understand how the rest of her squad managed to pay any of their living expenses since none of them had real jobs. At least she was doing something right, even if certain family members didn't agree. Her mother and father hadn't spoken to her since leaving Poland, but she wasn't surprised. The fight they'd had before she left still bothered her when she thought about it, but years later they hadn't tried to contact her. She wasn't going to be the first one to call. Her job and her friends were there for her, no matter what time of day. Her life was here, and she wouldn't change anything. She'd gone through too much to get where she was. Her past life was just that, the past. Her computer beeped, jolting her from her thoughts. The compile and push request was complete. A bit of unacknowledged tension released from her shoulders, one step closer to getting out of here. She glanced over at the top right corner for the results, green across the board. Sweet, I'll be able to get out on time. 3 minutes until she could log out and enjoy her weekend. She took a minute to tidy up her desk, frowning at the mess her cube mate Bashir had left on his. She grabbed her latest notebook, which held a sketch of 2 androgynous cats sword fighting. She shoved the notebook in the drawer and closed it with a satisfied finality. Everything was in order. Her desk tidy, she started closing down the various programs and logging out of command windows. The 4 green dots in the upper right of the compile window shone at her, a mild annoyance. She almost closed the window but paused just before clicking. Something about those green dots was wrong. She reread them, trying to figure out what was bothering her. 4 dots. Dev read, test compile, test push, and prod push. All green, so why did it bother her so much? Anxiety wiggled like worms in her stomach. She scanned the lights again. Dev read meant the repository for the development environment had been successful, and the code was live on the development environment. Test compile was green because the code was clean, no syntax errors. Test compile was the next layer in programming, the internally accessible environment. Only a dozen test players had access to test. The development environment compiled each night, so it could be tested the next day. The 4th one wasn't supposed to be green. It was supposed to be brown, non-active. Green meant the code had not only compiled, but gone to the production environment. It went live. Her chest tightened as realization flooded over her. Gone public? No, 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 no. The game wasn't slated to release for a few months. How could it be live already? Adriana's heart skipped a beat. She bit her lip and her clammy palm stuck to the top of the mouse. She had made the code go live? How is that even possible? She wasn't supposed to have access to the production environment. Her access was limited to testing the dev code, certifying it, and pushing it to test. That's all she was allowed to do. It couldn't have been her, could it? She pulled up the logs to scan for the pull and push requests. Sure enough, it was her login that pushed the latest request 17 minutes ago, processed, approved, and pushed to test at 6:57. Then at 6:58, the test environment was pushed to production. Aberzeski at dev test 3. And lines of code. Sudo password, Aberzeski, login approved. Aberzeski dev test 3, git push prod success. Aberzeski at dev test 3, prod compile test success. Aberzeski at dev test 3, prod restart success. Aberzeski at dev test 3, fdesk-1-dev-success. Aberzeski at dev test 3, fdesk-1-test-success. She stood up, rereading the last few lines in the log, trying to comprehend what was going on. Lesise had somehow used her password to gain access to the code. It was all her fault. Her mind screamed at her, telling her to run home, run anywhere but here. Her phone beeped. She picked it up and glanced at the screen, barely reading the latest message from Dorothy. She felt like she was in a dream, a ghost of herself separated from her body. Was she even real? Was all of this just a nightmare? Was she going to wake up any moment? Adriana deposited her phone face down on her desk and took a step back, her eyes not leaving the screen. The room felt very cold, and she rubbed her bare arms. Why the hell had she changed already? This couldn't wait, though. She couldn't run away from this. She needed to tell someone. She needed to tell everyone. The most anticipated game of the decade had gone live without any warning. This was worldwide newsworthy. Adriana raced down the hallway toward her manager's office, her heels slowing her progress, her friends forgotten, clubbing a distant memory, and her coffee growing cold on her desk. She had one thing to do before she got fired for gross incompetence, and that was to tell her supervisor. Scene break. Fuck, shit, fuck, shit, fuck, shit, fuck. Her life was over. Her career ended before it began, just 2 years out of college. This was it. She would have to move back to Poland, apologize to her parents, and hope they'd forgive her. She scrunched down even smaller on the hard plastic chair across from her supervisor. Yes, sir, I will get to the bottom of it, but Sven Tolan had been on the phone for the last 3 minutes talking to his boss. He glanced over at her, a concerned expression on his face. Not anger, but concern. He wasn't that kind of man. He was calm to a fault. He'd taken the blame on some of her mistakes in the past, shielding her from getting fired, but this was such a colossal fuck-up that even he couldn't save her. Yes, sir, but... Sven couldn't get a word in to save his life. He pulled the phone away from his ear. The constant stream of profanities coming from the receiver was clear enough to Adriana. She wanted to grab the receiver from her hand and scream that it was her fault, not his, but she didn't want to get him in any more trouble. Okay, I'll tell her. Sven placed the receiver down and ran his large, calloused hands through his blonde hair. The gold ring on his left hand sparkled in the bright, clear light of his office. He sighed, rubbing his eyes with his palms. Adriana watched the glint off his wedding ring. It was soothing somehow. It grounded her. Adriana, Sven spoke. His measured Dutch with its accented O's and E's rolled her name off his tongue with ease. Hearing her name brought forth a flood of emotion she didn't know she had. Her chest rose and fell in short, syncopated breaths. A knot formed in her throat, and she blinked to fight back tears. If he fired her right now, she would definitely lose it. She forced her breathing to slow. She had to get a hold of herself. Maybe she would go down swinging if it came to that. She wasn't a violent person, but she had the sudden urge to punch something. Laziz sent off notifications to all worldwide users with implants that the game was live, inviting them all to play. As of right now, he clicked once to refresh the website's counter. 3 million users. He leaned back, putting his hands behind his head and clicking his tongue while studying the screen. 3 million users in 15 minutes. I think we set a new world record here, don't you? They sat in silence for a moment, watching the counter roll over to 4 million. 3 years developing the AI, and the entire game, including engine, physics, graphics, story, and mechanics, had been coded in 6 months with minimal human involvement. 6 months of development, and 4 million users were now logged in. It had worked, though. No one had guessed that the AI would have launched itself 3 months early. It wasn't supposed to have the permissions, and that was where she had messed up. An odd serenity came over Adriana as she sat there with her supervisor watching the screen. She stood, shimming her skirt down. I'll go pack my things. Sven looked over at her and frowned. No, you won't. His voice was stern but compassionate. What do you mean, no? We don't fully understand what Laziz has done here. He leaned forward, his eyes wide. He implemented full immersion, something we only recently started testing internally. Can you imagine the legal nightmare if we inadvertently wipe someone's memory or trigger a seizure? What if someone doesn't know how to log out? We don't even know how tuned the pain receptors are with full immersion yet. Somehow he's built a fully fleshed out game under our noses. We know Laziz is quirky, but can we trust that he's got the user's best interests at heart? Last night when we compiled, we only had 5 million lines of code, but your last report shows 27 million. That is 22 million lines of code in one day. We have no idea what he's done, and I'm going to need your help to figure it out. Fast. Sven pulled his arms back over his head and rested his elbows on the desk. He bounced the tips of his interlocked fingers on his lips, and he kept his gaze on her face as a wry smile spread across his. He stopped and turned an aging picture on a gleaming silver frame around on his desk. A plump Hispanic woman held a small infant in her arms. He breathed, a slow inhale and fast exhale. His face relaxed. She knew he was worried, but he managed to soften his frustration and annoyance. He pointed to the picture. Also, if my daughter was in the same situation as you are right now, I wouldn't want her freaking out. None of us are going home until we figure out what happened and have a plan to fix it. We are expected on level 5 in 20 minutes to meet Art and explain everything we know. I expect you there, Adriana. She swallowed, her heart skipping a beat for the second time this evening. It sent knife-like shivers down her spine. Arthur? Geralta's coming here? She felt extremely underdressed to meet the president of Epic International. Why had she changed before the end of her shift? The whole thing happened because she stepped away from her computer. Sven smirked and nodded, spinning the picture back around and picking up the headset. Now I'm going to call my wife and let her know I won't be available this weekend, then talk to my daughter and apologize for not being there. Do you have anyone you need to call? Adriana remembered she had been trying to go out and party with her friends just a few minutes ago. Her phone was still sitting on her desk where she had left it, probably still buzzing from her squad. The weekend partying with her friends felt petty and trivial. No, I I think I'll get changed and be back in 10. Sven smiled and nodded and signaled for her to leave, then turned to his phone and began to dial. Chapter 1. He knew something was wrong the moment he logged in. There was another presence, a secondary interface that overrode his connection. He tried to open his mouth in warning, but the words had already become void as the whiteness of the login procedure took over. The first thing to go was his name, then his memories. He began to panic. How could he explain what was wrong if he couldn't remember his name? Someone yelled at him, a woman. He should have recognized her voice, but he couldn't understand what she was saying. Was it a memory? Was it real? What is reality but what we experience? Is it truly an illusion, as the philosophers say? He struggled to remember his past, but each time he picked up a memory, the secondary interface snatched it away one by one. As fast as he could grasp them, it removed them. He was empty, open, violated. Beyond trauma or feeling, he was blank, having lost everything that made him unique. Part of him wanted to resist, but resist against what? The warm enveloping whiteness? What was there to be afraid of? He had no history, no past, and future. He just is. What was a slate and how could it be blank? He is nothing and everything, matter and antimatter, word and void. Memories come back. They flood his mind, invasive, traumatic, life and death, despair and joy, love and destruction. They pained him. How can something so familiar feel so foreign? If he was nothing, then why would these memories be wrong? But they were wrong. They were forced. They were implanted, invasive, and immediate. The secondary presence was there, teaching him and forming him. Then it receded, its job done. There was a third presence, a stowaway. White became black, and he opened his eyes. As tensions continue to mount around Eloria, a new threat has begun to arise in the center of Panem. Sorry, there was a scene break before that. So, scene break. As tensions continue to mount around Eloria, a new threat has begun to arise in the center of Panem. Flanked by the sharp Tamor mountain range to the north, a murky swamp to the south, and oceans to the east and west, the Eternal Plains is in a strategic spot in the middle of the Panem continent. For hundreds of years, the passive Taraj lived in peace until the Nagos tried to take the land by force. Driven almost to the point of extinction, the Taraj have abandoned their nomadic lifestyle and banded together as one central tribe in order to repel the invaders that threaten their very existence. Children, the elderly, and the infirm are sequestered in a secret location known as Sunset Cove on the western edge of the plains, tucked under a cliff and surrounded by the foothills of the Tamor Mountains. Those who live here know nothing but safety in the cove, while the war for the survival of their race rages on outside their hidden borders. But the solstice winds bring change, and an acrid smell is in the air as you hoe the ground and plant more beets for the fall. This is where your story begins. Scene break. Matik Scarhoof, age 40, gender male, race Taraj, class none. Level 001, XP 0/200, health 100, mana 100, stamina 100. Talents none. Items shovel. Scene break. Maddox Scarhoof wrinkled his nose at the smoky smell wafting from the south. It reminded him of a campfire, warm and inviting. He could almost hear the pops and cracks of the wood as the tendrils of flame lapped gently at the driftwood bonfire. Shouts in the distance told him of the younger bulls at play, probably chasing one of the little cows around. Peals of laughter pierced the air as she narrowly escaped a game of tag. Preparations for tonight's bonfire, celebrating the summer solstice, were well underway in their small village. He looked forward to conferring with the spirit mother. He jammed his shovel into the hard-plowed earth and took a long drink from the water skin tied to his leathers. The virulent afternoon sun beat down on his dark hide, forcing him to take more breaks than usual. With every passing summer, the toil in the fields made the ache in his back worsen. He straightened up, rolling his broad shoulders, trying to get the kinks out. He splashed a handful of water in his face. It was cool and soothing in the oppressive heat. Lingering drops clung to his snout before evaporating. He took one last draw from the water skin, enjoying the water as it made its way to his stomach. The scar on his right leg itched, as it always did when something was on the back of his mind. A distant memory tried to surface, a warning, telling him he was missing something. He looked back over the field, scrutinizing the darkened, earthy soil. Each furrow tilled by his steady hand. No, he hadn't planted anything wrong. Perhaps he was simply tired. The smells of the campfire grew stronger, and there was yelling in the distance, but it washed over him as he breathed in. The air was now acrid, and it burned his lungs. He coughed to expel the vile smell. The bonfire wasn't being lit until midnight, so why was he smelling smoke? The screams he had thought to be Tari at play took on a sinister edge. Shivers ran through his shoulders despite the heat of the sun. He turned back towards the village, realizing the warning hadn't been a figment of his imagination. There really was a fire. The village barn was bathed in orange rivulets of flame. Black billowing smoke surged into the air, while dozens of pigs, chickens, and goats ran around, bleating and snorting. A dozen Taraj chased after their animals. Quest available. First alert. The barn in Sunset Cove is on fire. Seek the Elder Mother to find out how you can help contain the blaze. He dropped the shovel and lopped down the field, tromping the freshly tilled ground he'd so meticulously dug over the last 4 hours. His lame legs screamed as his hooves dug through the dirt. Nothing else mattered. He had to help his tribe. Elder Mother stood at the crossroads, pointing and barking orders to the Tari. Heckley, I have baskets stacked inside my hut. Bring those to capture the chickens. Talude, go help her. Her yellow flowing robes puffed from the breeze, mimicking the frenzy of the flames. She took a step back, shielding her face from the heat with her hands, the bells dangling on the tips of her horns, inaudible over the roar of the flames. Yanasi Scarhoof, the exasperated old cow, waved him over as he turned into town. She pointed a stubby arm behind her. There are buckets in the shed behind my house. He nodded once, pivoting on his good leg toward the back of her hut. His muscles burned with the effort. Ida, Minya, Sihu. The old cow pointed at 3 Tari gawking from across the road. Follow Scarhoof and help him organize the buckets. A euphoric sensation warmed his hooves, spreading through his legs and into his torso. The feeling startled him as something he'd never before experienced, yet felt rather normal. Beneath his health, stamina, and mana bars popped up a new one, XP, a boon given by the Spirit Mother to her children who have been called up to be an adventurer. For the first time in his life, Scarhoof got experience. The amount of experience on his bar barely registered, but it was there. He stared at the bar for a moment, not able to form thoughts. Why him? Why now? But he didn't have time to dwell on that as a message popped up, reminding him of the danger of the fire. Quest update. First alert. Organize a bucket brigade to quench the blaze. Gained 20 XP. Arriving at the back of the Elder Mother's hut, Scarhoof wrenched open the shed door, cracking the wood and throwing splinters in every direction. He grabbed the first 6 buckets stacked in the corner and addressed the Tari. Grab the rest and head to the watering hole. He didn't have time to organize them. They would figure it out and be behind him shortly. When he arrived back at the crossroads, Natine was there. He nearly tripped at the unexpected appearance of their village's newest member. Natine's soft feather stood talking to Elder Mother, an exasperated look on her face. Her long tan tail jerked back and forth in agitated movements. With most of the village composed of the infirm, elderly, or very young, Natine was an enigma. She was middle-aged, like Scarhoof, but not in the army. All able-bodied Taraj were in the army. He ground to a halt in front of her, his sudden stop throwing up sand. The heat from the blaze was intense, scalding his face and exposed arms. He couldn't risk anyone else being this close to the barn or getting harmed. It was his duty, his job. Softfeather, he held the buckets at her. Can you take the tar reed to the water and begin filling? I will douse the fire. She looked like he had just asked her to step into a latrine. She eyed him up and down. Beads of sweat rolled down his snout, and he wondered if it was from the flames or her glare. Perhaps she didn't hear him. Natine, he presented the buckets again. I'll toss the water on, but I need you to help get it from the pond. A wry smile crossed her lips, and she shook her head. While I appreciate the desire to keep me from harm, I am better suited being this close to the blaze. While you, she leaned back, taking in his full broad form, seem more suited for fetching. He eyed her for a moment, hot breath snorting out of his nostrils in a steamy miasma. Her unwavering gaze and cocky half-smile took only a moment before he broke. He didn't have time to argue with her if the blaze was to be contained. Follow me, Tari. Scarhoof's commanding baritone rang out over the crossroads. She turned, drawing her hands together, and began to chant. He hesitated for a moment. She was a spellcaster? The fire. He whirled on the collection of Tari crowding around him, indicating with his outstretched palm. Form a line from this spot to the watering hole. Alternate large and small. Move! He clapped his hands to jolt them into action. The half-dozen Tari fell into line. He and the largest Tari ended the line. He stepped into the murky depths of the town pond, 30 meters behind the barn. The water came up past his knees, helping to drain some of the heat from his sore legs. He plunged the first bucket into the water, then held it out. Pass it, he admonished. Yes, sir. As one of the 3 town guards, he was used to being called sir, though it never sat right with him. It was not lost on him that he had been a few years older than the Tari when he was first called to service. Younger and younger every year. He dunked 2 more buckets into the pond, filling them halfway to ensure the youngest of the Tari could continue to be of assistance. Keep going, Tari, nice and easy. In short order, the bucket brigade delivered water to the barn, passing the half-filled pails to Natine Softfeather, who now wielded a shimmering bubble around her. She took each bucket in turn, running practically into the fire to dispense it, and back out to give the bucket to the next Tauri, who ran them back to Scarhoof. Elder Mother stood some ways away, waving her arms to contain the blaze in pockets of air, preventing it from jumping to the fields. He tried not to stare, but it was fascinating to watch the two cows work, particularly Natine. He hadn't known her long. She appeared in Sunset Cove about 3 months ago. One day the hut across from Elder Mother's home was abandoned. The next day there was a new occupant. Elder Mother had introduced her at the next bonfire, but that had been the extent of the introductions. Life had seemed a little brighter since she showed up. Still, she had managed to get into the cove while he was on watch, and he hadn't figured out how she'd done it. Her bypass still grated on his mind. Before long, the fire had been put out, and Natine dropped whatever spell she had put in place to protect herself from the heat. Despite dancing in and out of the burning building, she didn't have a whiff of smoke or soot on her face or hooves. She sauntered over to him. "You did an admirable job there, Scarhoof." She gave a curt nod. The silver ring in her ear matched the larger one in her nostrils. Her piercing black eyes twinkled as she shot him a smile, then turned to collect the Tauri. "Come now, Tauri, we need to find these animals that have scattered to the wind." He found himself admiring her backside, her strong haunches, thick legs, and stout tail swishing back and forth. She was one fine heifer. She turned again, facing Scarhoof, who quickly looked up from her swishing tail. If she had noticed him admiring her backside, she didn't seem to care. "Since you were such a help at the barn, perhaps you would be a dear and find a way to mend the fence and help the Tauri round up these animals." Scarhoof's thick tongue lolled in his mouth as he struggled to find the words. Had his brain short-circuited? Quest update. First alert. Get all the animals back to the pen and find a way to fix the gate. Gained 20 XP. Getting his thoughts in order, he pursed his lips and gave her a stout nod. "Of course, Natine." She studied him for a moment before touching his shoulder. "Thank you." She turned to shoo a couple of the smaller Tauri away from the smoldering wreckage. He noticed Elder Mother sitting under the awning of her hut, a knowing grin on her face while she rocked back and forth. Scarhoof turned, his heart fluttering in his chest. Chapter 2. He ignored the old cow and turned his attention to the burned-down barn. While the flames were now gone, the distinct crack and pop of smoldering embers told him that there was still an immense amount of heat contained in the wreckage. The ground was wet with ash, forming a gray mass all over the ground. It oozed around his hooves. He growled, searching for a stick to dig the grime out. It'd be a pain to clean out and would get everywhere in the village over the next couple days. That's when he heard a snort and saw the telltale flash of pink. He turned and walked around to the back of the barn, following the sound. Sure enough, a lone pig dug in the muck, its little tail swishing back and forth. Sizing up the swine, he tried to sneak forward, but a spasm from his lame leg sent a jolt of pain through his body. He managed to stay upright, but landed heavy-hoofed about a handspan shy of the beast, startling it and sending it running with a caustic wail. The animal ran between his legs. When he tried to reach for it, he slipped and landed face first in the gray muck. He tried to stand on the slippery floor, but found one of his horns had launched itself in a wooden post. Embarrassed, he swore under his breath and yanked hard, tearing the hunk of wood and releasing himself from its prison. He galloped after the escaped pig, which had run back towards the farmland where Scarhoof had toiled that morning. The breezy air cooled his skin and dried out the muck clinging to him. He brushed off some of it as he ran to the fields. They were hard to notice, the pig's prints, but the gray dustings on the wheat stalks were more obvious. "I've got you now, piggy." 20 years tilling these fields in a 3-bull rotation had made him intimately familiar with every stalk and furrow. A rogue pig could wreak havoc on all their hard work. It was bad enough the barn had burned down. They had lost all the wheat stored in burlap sacks on the hayloft. This field of wheat was going to be vital to the tribe's survival come winter. "Here, piggy, piggy," he called out, his normal baritone voice and falsetto, hoping to encourage the pig to come to him. He knew it was ridiculous. In his entire time in Sunset Cove, the pigs never showed intelligence or obeyed commands, hence the now broken fence to keep them penned in. He heard a snort to the right and caught a flash of pink flesh. Well, look at that, it worked. He repeated the noise, and the snorting grew closer, the stalks of golden wheat pushing to the side as the pig moved toward him. To his left, another sound joined in, a scratching, sniffing sound, followed by a feral scream. Scarhoof turned just as a flash of brown and white came at him. Something clamped down on his upper calf. Pain shot through his leg. He yelled out in surprise and kicked, trying to shake off his attacker. The frightened pink pig bolted, and Scarhoof swore at the retreating animal before turning his focus on the beast that dared attack him. It was a large, mottled brown bear, 1/2 meter long, excluding its tail. It hung from his leg despite his thrashing. He gained his wits and stopped trying to swing it off. Instead, he punched his face. 2 hits loosened the beast's jaw, and it squealed and scampered off. That counts as 2. Effect status. Bleeding. -1 health per second. What was a boar? Oh, it was a boar, not a bear. Sorry, guys. What was a boar doing in Sunset Cove? And so large. The only animals not domesticated by the Taraj were some crabs from the ocean and the kobolds. They lived in a cave on the other side of the cove. He looked at his leg, the pain throbbing up his spine and pulsing in his head. The damn thing had gnawed teeth marks past his hide and into his flesh. His health trickled away from the blood effect, and he felt lightheaded. He almost didn't notice how quiet it was. He couldn't hear the boar he had just punched. It creeped him out. Noise was normal. Quiet wasn't. Then he heard it. Noises to his right and left clued him in. He was being hunted, and he needed a weapon. Blood continued to drip down his leg, catching in the scar on his hoof. He backed up, favoring his left leg, and searching for something to use as a weapon. Between 2 rows of wheat, a stick lay on the ground, possibly an old walking stick that had been broken in half. It would have to do. He reached down and grabbed it, swinging it around to get a feel for the weight and balance. Item received, stick. Base damage 1, speed 1, DPS 1. The scratching sounds were now joined by snorts. They were getting closer. A larger patch of wheat swayed to his left. He took a couple steps back, trying to put some distance between himself and the unseen enemy. 2 feral boars leapt from the wheat. One had a swollen white eye, probably the one he had punched. The other was larger, as he had expected. The large one seemed the more dangerous of the two, with its massive pointed tusks and piercing white eyes full of hate and anger. He had gone from chasing an escaped pig to defending himself in a moment. Now wasn't time for introspection, however. Now was the time to defend. He limped backwards, his right leg still bled, and his health ticked down slowly. He swung the stick back and forth as the 2 boars danced just outside its range. With a grunt, both boars attacked at once. He got one good hit in on the larger of the 2, but traded the hit for another bite on his left hand. In the distance, the localized squeal of pigs and clucking of chickens told him that more animals were being returned to the pen. He turned, leading the feral boars deeper into the fields and away from the vulnerable Tari. The boars dodged a swing, breaking apart and coming at him from 2 sides. He now fought on 2 fronts. While he managed to keep the larger one at bay, the smaller would come up to bite him when his back was turned. A few solid hits with a stick would finish him off for sure, but the feral boar refused to back down. Despite the smaller boar's flagging health, he decided to face the larger one because it was doing far more damage. Scarhoof's health began to flail, the trail of blood from his injuries a sad tale. He continued to back away from the village, hitting as often as he could. They whittled his life away with jabs and grunts. He needed to end this, but between the constant spinning and loss of blood, he was dizzy. He fainted, and the smaller one dodged out of the way. He caught it with a stick, using its momentum against it. He whacked it again and was rewarded with a resounding crunch of bone. The smaller boar squeaked out its last, but the others didn't hesitate. He leapt onto his back, goring him with one of his upturned tusks. It jumped off and dodged out of the way. Ah! Searing fire shot down his spine as he whirled around, swinging the stick. His health was now dangerously low. The gouge in his back took nearly a quarter of his health away in one attack. The edges of his vision, which had already begun to fade, contracted almost instantly as noises around him took an echo-like quality. He thought he heard a faint clomp of hooves around him. Maybe it was the spirits coming to take him away. He didn't want to die like this, from a boar alone in a field. Blackness pushed in from all sides. He fell to his knees, the dull pain from landing on his injured leg barely registered. The feral enemy snarled, brandishing its tusks again. Scarhoof noticed the boar's eyes were a milky white, and he noticed something sticking out of its fur behind one of its ears, like a tumor. His eyes began to close. He swung the stick once more, trying to keep the vicious enemy at bay, but he knew it would do no good. His movements were sluggish and dreamlike. Scene break. Scarhoof knew he was dead, but death didn't come. Instead, a warm, pulsing green glow enveloped his body, causing his health to spike up just before he ran out of life. His hide prickled with goosebumps as the healing spell cooled his heated skin. He felt renewed and re-energized. He was still bleeding, but he was alive. He didn't know how, but he didn't have time to think about it. He had a boar, tusks down, running at his face for a killing blow. Scarhoof swung, connecting with the boar's left leg with a sickening crack. The boar tipped and drove into the ground, burying its tusks in the soil. The boar squealed, flipping over as one of its tusks hit a rock and snapped. Scarhoof rolled onto his hooves and stood, keeping the boar in front of him as it dislodged itself from the dirt. was severely damaged now, with a broken leg, tusk, and swollen eye, but nothing was more dangerous than an animal with nothing to lose. It sniffed the air before leaping at him. Scarhoof danced, dodged, and swung, taking off health one swing at a time. His head swiveled. He tried to find the healer while keeping the boar at bay. Natine Softfeather stood in a defensive stance about 20 meters away, her hands ready to cast another spell. Her eyes narrowed as she watched him dance around the rabid monster's attacks. Thank you, Scarhoof smiled at Natine, dodging another bite from the rabid enemy. I was nearly dead. I saw that. You're lucky I heard the crying and squealing. I thought there might be a Tari cornered by a loose chicken. She tossed another heel on him with a sparkle in her eye. Green energy surrounded and filled him with a resurgence in power, topping off his health. He struck the boar twice in a row this time. Almost dead, it limped and panted with each breath, but it refused to relinquish or run away. 2 more hits finished it off. The feral boar gave up its last breath with a whimper and a grunt, falling onto its side. Scarhoof slumped down to the ground when a familiar warmth washed over him, starting at his hooves and extending to his torso. XP rolled in, ticking the bar up slightly. He looked up at Natine, who loomed over him with a concerned but curious expression. She looked as shocked as he felt. Well, I'll be. Congratulations, Scarhoof. You've progressed. Spirit Mother must see great things for you if you were chosen like this, and so late in life, too. He ignored the slight at his age. He was too elated. This was stupendous news. All his life he'd wondered what it would be like to be chosen by her. Too long had he suffered, too long feeling hurt and alone, cast out. But even as he begun to accept his lot in life, there had always been a yearning for adventure. The time had arrived for him, and it hurt. As soon as the euphoric feeling of gaining experience left him, the pains of the previous battle reminded him that he was not a young bull. Fights took more out of him. The bites on his neck, legs, and hands burned with a fiery intensity. Blood continued to ooze from the wounds. Natine leaned over, cradling his head with her hands, just above his thick neck. Her touch was soft and gentle, but he stifled nonetheless. No mind, Matuk. I'm simply... I guess that makes sense. She pulled her hand away and used her apron to clean his blood from her hands. He looked up at her, the sun blotted out by her frame, casting a cool shadow on his face. Something wrong? He could feel his health depleting. He stood there, his life ticking away like sand in an hourglass. He would need another heal soon, and would need to bind the wounds back at the village. Something bright caught his eye from the direction of his fallen foe. He turned to look at it when she spoke. It shouldn't surprise you, but you're now an adventurer. More than that, you and I now share a unique kinship. His heart jumped in his chest. What kind of kinship did they share? You're a shaman, Matuk, she said with a wink. Character update. Matuk Scarhoof is now a shaman. New skill, Mending Force, core class skill. Health 50, cost 5, heal 50, cost 5, cast time 2, envelopes the target in a spiritual embrace, healing minor wounds, also restores 5% stamina. Scarhoof sat for a second, his knees weak, his mind racing. He was a shaman? It was the rarest of the classes of the Taraj, but also one of the most sacred, most revered. He had so many questions, he couldn't focus on which one to ask. Did he need instruction? Who would teach him? Was there a shaman school? Then doubt crept in. He was too old to be selected. Most of those chosen by Spirit Mother were young, energetic, ready and willing to travel the world for her, not bogged down with responsibility, age, and injury. He was one of 3 guards in Sunset Cove. After the accident with the barn, there would be even more work to be done. She interrupted his thoughts, pointing at his bleeding back. I suppose I should teach you your first skill so you can remove this bleeding, shouldn't I? Go ahead, stand up now. He stood, his health having depleted significantly while he had sat there. He was lightheaded and his limbs felt heavy. His knees trembled as he struggled to keep his balance. Now pay attention, Natine turned sideways so he could see the movements of her hands. She spun them counterclockwise while moving her fingers in odd, juddering motions that reminded him of the quick movements of a rabbit. She did it again, then a 3rd time. I know it seems odd, but once you do it 1,000 times, you'll never think about it. The fingers are the hardest part. Now you try. No, like this. See? Very good. Now let's add the vocals. He did as she instructed without hesitation. A sudden rush of power enveloped his body as the energy built between his hands released. Inside him, the magic filled him with determination. His health spiked, nearly healing him completely, and renewed vigor flooded his body. Had he cast his first spell? Now, one more time. To get rid of the bleeding effect, you have to fully heal. You're going to need to hit yourself once, then a 2nd time immediately after. He did it. The first time felt more natural, but the wave of energy from the second heal felt different, more personal. His skin closed, and the bleeding stopped. Natine clapped her hands together and squealed with a girlish delight, something he had never heard from her before. It was like she was a whole new person. She had seemed so studious, almost sullen. Now she was excited, filled with genuine joy. Watching her clap her hands with giddy delight roused a deep-seated memory that he couldn't place. For just an instant, a word flashed across his mind before disappearing into the vagueness of history. Cheerleader. Shaking away the unstable feeling he had, he smiled at Natine, then bowed on all fours. Despite it being an overly formal gesture, he felt it was the right thing to do. She chuffed. No need for that. We're equals, you and I. But she trailed off as she looked at the larger of the two dead boars. What is that? He knew what she was talking about. He had noticed it earlier. They both sidled up to the dead boar, whose limp body had stopped twitching. Its open eyes were a disturbing milky white, with striations that seemed to ebb and flow, like a foamy ocean inside a glass globe. I'm not sure, but I noticed it while we were fighting. Scarhoof bent down to get a better look at the back of the boar's skull, where an object was sticking out. Using his stick, he turned the body of the dead animal over, and they both stared. It seemed to be growing out of its head. It was milky white, like the creature's eyes. Sunlight bounced off it at odd angles, giving the impression there was a mixture of different shades of white liquid swirling around each other. Only this was solid and looked like a jagged stone. Scarhoof bent down and touched the crystalline-looking protrusion. Just before the pad of his finger came in contact with the object, a jolt of energy shot up to his arm. He recoiled with a shout. You okay? She looked concerned and touched him lightly on the forearm, a gesture that shot a very different type of energy through his body. He stared at his finger as he massaged his forearm. Yeah, it didn't hurt. It was odd, but somehow familiar. Perhaps he was feeling jumpy after the harrowing events of the day. He carefully placed his finger on the shard again and waited, but there wasn't a jolt this time. Instead, a heated pulsing of energy rushed up his arm and into his shoulder. It reminded him of standing on a beach in the heat of the sun while a roiling thundercloud in the distance charged the air. It was power and peace, warm anticipation. A buff appeared. Effect status. Spirit Shard Touch. Plus 10% spirit abilities, plus 5% to fire and earth abilities, negative 5% to water and air abilities. Duration 10 minutes. Scarhoof pondered the message for a moment. He had rarely heard of spirit abilities, let alone affinities. This day was quickly becoming overwhelming. So much had changed in such a short time. This morning he'd woken up in his guard's cot, like he'd done for the last 20 years, but instead of laying back down exhausted at the end of a long day, he had helped put out a raging fire, fought off monsters, and now he knew a spell. He now belonged to an elite class of magic wielders known as shaman. Even mulling the word over in his mind didn't fully sink in the gravity of what had happened. He was so lost in thought at all the changes swirling around him that he didn't notice Natine reaching down to touch the shard. Ow! Natine pulled her hand back, shaking it and doing a sort of shuffling dance. Scarhoof jumped to his hooves, adrenaline coursing through his veins at the sudden exclamation. Are you okay? What happened? That thing hurt, she pointed, her arm trembling. Wait, she looked at him with squinted eyes. It didn't hurt you? Her tone was almost accusatory, and he took a step back, raising his hands. I don't know why it didn't hurt me. Her eyes softened, and her demeanor shifted to one of warmth. It's because you're an adventurer, Matuk. You're special. You really are. The Spirit Mother is going to have great things for you. He noticed she had called him by his tribal name instead of his given name. She looked back at the village. In the distance, a wisp of smoke still rose from the ashes of the burned-down barn. A handful of people were raising up the last of the fences to pen in the pigs. That reminded him he still needed to complete his quest. She continued, You'll be leaving us soon. I know that now. She stared at the barn, her voice hiding a pain that Scarhoof had never heard from her before. He stepped forward, feeling very tall in her presence. I won't leave, I promise. He took her shaking hand in his, squeezing to punctuate his words. She turned around, startled by how close he was, and took a step back, still retaining a wry smile. Don't make promises you can't keep, adventurer. Just promise me you'll follow when the Spirit Mother comes calling. I know that... She stopped and turned away. Never mind. We can talk later. She pulled a scarf from inside a pocket in her skirts and handed it to Scarhoof. Can you wrap the shard in this and hand it back? I think as long as I don't handle it directly, it won't affect me like it did before. He complied. The shard offered little resistance as he pulled it from the boar's neck. He wasn't sure if it had grown there or had been lodged there by force, but it wasn't buried in very deep. It popped free with a slurping sound and blood dripped from its edge. He wrapped it in the scarf and handed it back to her. She frowned, probably because her scarf was now covered in a dead animal's blood. Thank you. She took it, hesitantly at first. Then once she verified that it didn't injure her, she smiled. I think this will work, but I want to run some tests on it before I make any final judgment. Come see me when you finish your quests. I'd like to discuss some things with you that I think might help you on your way. She took a single step toward the village, then stopped and turned back. Her face was a mix of emotions, but her eyes were soft and contemplative. Her trembling lip, however, gave away something deeper. I'm glad for you. With that, she whirled on her hoof and walked away. Quest available. A spreading sickness. Check with Natine after she's had a chance to lick the shard. He watched her walk away, lips pursed as he took in the gentle sway of her tail. Oh! Natine whirled around to face him. She pointed at the stick on the ground next to the boar. I noticed you were pretty handy with that weapon. He glanced at the blood-covered stick and shrugged. It was available. She gave him a knowing nod, but something in her eyes told him she had more to say. It was, wasn't it? If you're interested, I might suggest a bow for a weapon. Every adventure needs a good weapon, right? In fact, I think I know just the one, something that hasn't been used in a very long time. I'll leave it with the Elder Mother. Quest available, a bow by any other name. Check with Elder Mother to upgrade your weapon. And with that, she spun on her hoof and galloped away, her light brown mane bouncing with each stride. Chapter 3. Scarhoof arrived at Elder Mother's house an hour later. He had finally found the lost pig in the fields and assisted with placing the last few posts to keep the animals penned in. The younger Tari were tasked with watching the weaker points of the fence until new posts could be made and new post holes dug. Things that could wait until tomorrow. Elder Mother, he stopped before her hut to wipe his hooves off on the gnarl roots kept outside, their scratchy barbs gouging the muck from his hooves. It gave him a deep sense of peace to finally remove all the gunk crammed in there. So much in the world you couldn't control, but the grind between his hooves was one he could. Her hut was much like the rest of them, thatched roof, wooden planks for the siding, but of all the huts in the village, hers was the only one he would have called a home. Oh, Matuk, come in, Elder Mother greeted him with a warm, toothy smile. She was as old as any Taraj he'd ever known. 85 years was the rumor, though no one dared ask her. Everyone knew once your horns began to yell and crack, it was impolite to bring up age. His were not far from the same fate. It was warm and inviting inside. A thick woven mat covered the entire floor, featuring brilliant golds and blues and angular patterns. It was firm with just the right amount of give for comfort. The place was appointed with tables, shelves, stools, and a large hearth on the back wall made of hewn red sandstone. It was decidedly rustic, but the old cow's homey flair made it feel welcome. Dotting the tabletops were wooden toys and knickknacks from her travels. There was even a painting with her, a bull who must have been her husband at some point, and a small female Tari with a brown mane. Standing taller than most, his black horns nearly grazed the ceiling, and he suddenly felt out of place in such personal space, like a bull in a china shop. The thought flashed through his mind, along with that odd, doesn't belong feeling he had previously, like a false memory trying to surface. He ignored the odd feeling. Elder Mother put her hand on his. Matuk, thank you for coming. I am grateful you were in the village today to help us with the blaze. How are things coming out there? All the animals are wrangled, and we have Tari watching to make sure they stay that way. Quest complete. First alert. You helped contain the fire, organized the bucket brigade, and brought all the animals back to the pen. Gain 100 XP. She smiled, patting his hand. Please, sit. I'll get us some tea. I hear you had an interesting time with their Natine out in the fields. She turned for the hearth and grabbed the kettle off one of the nearby shelves. Scarhoof grabbed one of the stools from the corner. Elder Mother swore under her breath, frustrated with the lack of fire in the hearth. Blasted thing is never here when you want it to be. She snapped her fingers and a small flame burst into being on the handful of logs in the hearth. She then twirled her finger and a cyclone of air whirled around inside the hearth, stroking the fire into a roaring cacophony in seconds. He sat down, but then jumped back up at a noise from the doorway. Elder Mother? The voice was small and timid. Sihu, what is it, dear? Elder Mother turned around at the interruption. Everything all right? The small dark brown Tiru held her hands open. A shiny blue scale filled both of her palms. I found this behind the barn. I think a pig was trying to get to it. She held the blue scale up with her fingertips. There was a crash as the kettle dropped from Elder Mother's hands and hit the ground. Lukewarm water sprayed everywhere as a large crack split up the side. She reached for the nearby table with both hands, like she was drowning in an ocean and reaching out for safety, a piece of driftwood salvation. Her bright eyes were wide with concern as she stared at the blue scale. Memories flooded Scarhoof's mind. Nagos, a battle long ago, death and disfigurement on both sides. His scar itched from the painful memories. Where did you get that? Elder Mother gasped for a breath, the tip of her tail twitching back and forth, drumming the brick hearth in a dull thump every half second. Behind the barn, Miss Natine said I should show you this, that you would trade me for a candy. Elder Mother's face softened, and her shocked expression turned to a smile as she took a hesitant step forward. Well, Natine is very smart. In fact, for being so swift, I'll give you 2. Now, did you see who dropped this, or was it just the little piggies? She glanced sidelong at Scarhoof, her eyes bearing her true feelings. The Nagos were a group of water dwellers that hunted the Taraj. They particularly liked to eat the Tari, finding their flesh the most succulent. They called their catches veal, a word in their language used to instill fear. It was a banned word among the village, but all the children knew it and used it to punctuate particularly hateful speech. His head swam as he realized what this meant. His job was to protect the cove, and their most ardent enemy might be in their midst right now. I only saw the piggies. They were digging in the dirt and threw this out. I would have come to you right away. Elder Mother put a reassuring hand on the Tari's forearm, taking the blue scale from the little girl. Thank you for bringing this to me, little one. She reached into her apron and brought 2 small candies. As promised, if you find any more, you can get more candy, okay? The 2 exchanged their objects, and the Tari was sent on her way to play. Oh, this isn't good. Not good at all. Elder Mother motioned for Scarhoof to sit again, something he promptly did. He glanced at the forgotten tea kettle, cracked and broken on the floor, and wondered if was a portent of things to come. Scene break. Elder Mother finished scribbling the note, signed it with a flourish, and folded it twice before handing it to Scarhoof. Take this back with you to the guard station and have card call delivered to Chieftain Bloodhorn. Pang of guilt washed over him. He wanted to go, but that was not his lot in life. Despite being the youngest of the 3 guards, his gimp leg wouldn't allow him to make it there in time. Card call Thunderdraft would make better time. Quest available, Mysterious Blue Scale. Elder Mother has asked you to give Card call Thunderdraft a message for Chieftain Bloodhorn in Whistling Pass. After accepting the quest, he stood, took the note, and placed it in his skirt pocket. I will deliver it, Elder Mother. She gave him a warm, motherly smile, then her face scrunched up like she was trying to remember something. Scarhoof waited, feeling she had more to say. Something in his stomach clenched, like he should have known this already. Before you go, and since you're headed out that way, I could use some herbs for tonight's bonfire. Would you be a dear and grab them for me? She handed him another slip of paper he hadn't known she was carrying. Here's the list. Quest available. Bonfire preparations. Elder Mother has asked you to collect the following items near the entrance to Sunset Cove. They must return in the next 2 hours, so they can be used for the bonfire tonight. Stinging nettles, motherwort, passion flower pods, echinacea, wild bergamot. He stared at the quest for a moment, bothered that he would be off adventuring at a time like this. Shouldn't I be at the guard station if we were sending Cardcott to the plains? Her eyes narrowed while she pursed her lips. She shook her head with a melancholy expression. With the Spirit Mother blessing you received today, you simply cannot wait for the next bonfire. Sonvi will be able to keep watch. We never needed 3 of you here anyway, as the cove is already very protected and hidden. Scarhoof accepted the quest and gave a nod to the old cow. A timer appeared in his vision, just under the quest text to the right side. Oh, Matuk, Elder Mother's soft but piercing voice stopped his step as he exited her hut into the early afternoon air. Natine brought a present for you. She said you would know what it was. Curious, he pivoted on one hoof to see her holding a long, dark wood staff. 3 riveted bands of finger-width bronze encircled the ends of the weapon. Corded rope wound about the center, creating a stout grip for his large hands. White runes carved down the entire length stood out against the blackened grain. She held it out to him, and he hesitated before taking it. It was the nicest-looking staff he'd ever seen. Accepting such a gift without the bearer present felt wrong. He would have to thank Natine for this gift. Item received, charred bow, base damage 1-3, speed 1, DPS 2. Quest complete. A bow by any other name. Elder Mother has given you Natine's bow. Wield it well, for its original owner has been lost to time. It was thick and dense, weighing more than he expected. The wood was a deep pitch color darker than his hide, with a tight grain and glossy finish. The bow felt right in his meaty hands, the perfect thickness and balance. An ominous hum echoed through his fingers as he tracked the carved runes with his fingers. You should also take this. Elder Mother held something else out to him. A small leather harness wrapped around his shoulders to secure the bow behind his back when not in use. She helped him into the harness, and he found that he could easily pull out the weapon when needed. Now go on out of here. I need those herbs back soon. He hadn't forgotten. The timer continued to tick down, an ever-present reminder that he was on the clock. He turned to the north, hoofing it past the farms. Scene break. Just outside of the village proper, which was pinned in against the coastline, Scarhoof entered the rest of Sunset Cove. Scrub trees and sagebrush littered the rocky terrain. The imposing red sandstone walls loomed larger on this side than they did by the sunny entrance to the seaside cove. He stood for a moment on a small rise, the village behind him, and in front of him the vast desolation disappeared into the darkness. He'd always liked standing between the two disparate stretches of land, like he had one hoof in two different worlds. The difference in the sand and trees was distinct, with the finer sand closer to the shore. Farther inland, the terrain was littered with coarse sand, pebbles, rocks, and boulders. Chaos and order, wildlife and domestication. Being a guard, he spent most of his time out in the scrubs and in the shadow of the cove. He returned often to work the fields, never fully belonging, yet working for the good of all. It was his dichotomy, injured at the prime of his life, just as he took entered bullhood, only to be crippled and relegated to guard duty. His first step onto the rocky surface reminded him how carefully he needed to be with his injured leg after all the fighting today. His hooves wobbled as he tried to maintain purchase, but he soon found himself making more comfortable strides. A hint of a path wound its way up toward a small cutout in the rock that marked the guard station. He ambled toward it, looking out over the terrain. The quest timer continued to nag at him, a gentle reminder that he had herbs and flowers to find. While he didn't want to wait too long to deliver the missive to the guard station, he also knew Cardcaw wouldn't head out until the morning. To his left, something stood out. A small, white flower grew in the shade of a large boulder. This deep into the cove, the wall's inward slope kept much of the terrain from receiving sunlight, giving a distinct chill to the air. A shiver ran up his spine as he stepped off the path and toward the small flower. He bent down, grabbed the plant, and tugged. Quest update. Bonfire preparations. Motherwort, 1 of 10. The 0 next to the motherwort entry increased by 1 when the quest updated. He frowned as he looked out over the vast emptiness, but didn't see another flower anywhere. This was going to take a while. Quest update, bonfire preparations, motherwort, 10 of 10. Sorry, there was a scene break before that too. So scene break, quest update, bonfire preparations, motherwort, 10 of 10. Finally, he thought. The hunt had been arduous, but after 30 minutes, Scarhoof had managed to find all the motherwort, stinging nettles, echinacea, and all but one of the wild bergamot. He hadn't seen a single passion flower anywhere and wasn't sure he would recognize it if he found it. At least he'd know what to look for with the others, but he'd never heard of this flower before today. He should have asked Elder Mother for a description. This far away from the coast, the gentle lap of the ocean had long since faded, replaced by a droning hum which echoed off the darker recesses of the cove sandstone walls. The sound was intoxicating and song-like. It was the noise of his life, the sound he had fallen asleep to for the last 20 years. The swarm of insects coordinated their noises into something grander than mating calls. He soon found himself humming along as he continued to scout along the grass, looking for more of the items Elder Mother wanted. He crested a small rise and stopped as he noticed movement in the distance. 2 small kobolds, each a meter in height, danced around a large gray bush. They wore small loincloths and shook things in their hands. They had green skin and flat noses. Their pointy ears flopped around above their heads as they stomped around in a well-worn groove in the earth. Covered with thorns and fuzzy web of some kind, the bush looked more like a cocoon than a plant. Closer inspection told him this was an important plant. Inside the web-like covering were large blue pods that pulsed with a golden glow. This was the plant he was looking for. It had to be passion flower. He wondered why the kobolds, scurrying like little scavengers that steal trinkets from the village, were dancing around the bush. They were a feral species, with only basic verbal skills. Living in a cave on the back wall of the cove, they were rarely seen, and Scarhoof had only had to chase them from the cove entrance a handful of times in 2 decades he had been stationed there. He surveyed the rest of the area, finding no other plants remotely like this one in front of him. He knew what he had to do. He needed those pods. This should be easy. They wore no weapons, only a loincloth and the strange handheld noisemaker. He was at least twice their height, not 3 times. Puffing up his chest and squaring his shoulders, he trotted directly at them, horns first. They noticed him when he was halfway down the rise. He built up speed for his attack. He wasn't going to gore them, just frighten them. As he arrived at the bottom of the slope, he realized they weren't running away. Instead, they squared off against him. Worse, they seemed to be defending the bush he needed. He slowed to a trot, not wanting to run right into them, eventually stopping a half-dozen paces away. Now that he was closer, he could see that their skin was a lot grayer than he had originally thought, with striations of dark green. There was something wrong with their eyes. They had the same milky white look of the massive feral boar he had killed earlier. The 3 stood there, unmoving, and cautiously eyeing each other. He looked for a crystalline growth on their heads, but saw none. Their eyes didn't show the shifting white that the boars had. "Greetings," Scarhoof said, placing one hand above his heart and bowing in deference to them. He had no desire to hurt them. The unloving glare he received in return chilled his heart. Both kobolds held the musical instruments in front of them like weapons. Now that he had a closer look at the plant, he realized they wielded the very pods he was here to collect. The pods were larger than he had expected and covered in barbed thorns all around the bulbous end. They shook the pods, still holding them at the ready, making a rattling noise. Like there were dried beans or something in there. Regardless of the size of the creatures or their makeshift weapons, it didn't look like he was going to convince them with words. He took a step back, raising his hands, palms open to signify he meant no harm. He would make his retreat and figure out another way to get the passion flowers for Elder Mother. But the kobolds had a different opinion. They took his retreat as an opening for a fight. As soon as he moved, they both screamed a high-pitched shrill battle cry and charged him. Luckily, they were slow, and he was able to sidestep their initial attack. They immediately split up to flank him. 2 times in one day? Not again. Scarhoof gritted his teeth as he dug in his hooves to the rocky terrain. He wouldn't be the victim again, and Teen wasn't around to save him. He reached behind and grabbed the weapon strapped to his back, pulling it free in one clean motion and swinging it out at the kobold in front of him. Despite the decades since he had been in the army, his training with weapons came back to him with surprising ease. The endless hours of drilling against target dummies was starting to pay off. Despite only ever seeing the enemy once, his years of hard labor and field work had kept him in shape. He smacked the kobold's head and took off half of its health with one critical hit. He continued to back up, using his longer stride to his advantage, and kept them both in his sight line. He found the groove they had been carving around the passion flower plant and continued to back up in it. Both kobolds had to jog to keep up with him. They danced like this for a few moments, them swinging at him with their pods, trying to stick him with the thorns. He used the bulbous end of his bow to keep them out of attack range. He connected his staff to the already injured kobold, striking him down. He had overextended. The other kobold, seeing his kin fall to the ground, made a slash at him. Scarhoof dodged by jumping backwards. Scarhoof tripped over a rock that jutted from the side of the groove and fell sideways into the massive passion flower plant. His health plummeted as hundreds of barbs embedded themselves into his skin. The pain from each would have barely registered, but he could feel something seep into him that burned just under his skin. Effect status, bleeding, -1 health per second. As he pulled away, each barb broke off, leaving hundreds of cuts across his back, arms, and legs. He swung his bow with reckless abandon, the pain almost overwhelming his vision as tears filled his eyes. His bow slammed into something squishy, sending jarring motions up its length and into his hands. With blurry vision, he watched the second kobold slump to the ground. Quest available. Killer kobolds. You were attacked by rabid kobolds while collecting the herbs for tonight's bonfire. Report the strange activity to the Elder Mother. He activated Mending Force twice in a row to bring him to full health and stop the bleeding, but the bleeding didn't stop. Effect status, bleeding. Your attempt to remove the bleeding effect has failed. Remove the spines causing the bleeding effect and try again. He sighed, dejected. His back was covered in spines. He would never manage to get them all out on his own. He glanced at the timer ticking down. 45 minutes left until he needed to return the flowers to Elder Mother, and he still didn't have the passion flowers needed. He also needed to deliver the note for the chieftain to Cardcaw and catch his fellow guards up on the happenings of the day. He turned to the large plant that had become his bane and, using the bow, carefully popped off one of the large seed pods. Quest update, bonfire preparations, passion flower pod, 1 of 10. At least he had the right items. He decided that fulfilling the quest was more important than taking the time to try to remove the barbs from his skin. His mana regenerated with more than enough time to keep his health topped off. He would finish obtaining the pods, then hoof it to the guard station, and be back in time to complete the quest. I'm going to take another drink, because I think I skipped out on one when he killed the kobold. Chapter 4. Despite his detour into the kobold territory, he made it back to the path and jogged toward the crack in the curved walls that made up the cove. All around him, the looming sandstone cast glowing shadows, making it harder to see. More than once he paused to heal himself and to make sure he was still on the path. A nervous chill ran up his spine. He wished he'd thought about bringing a torch or had asked Elder Mother for a glow orb, but he probably would have broken it in his fight with the kobolds. The constant healing helped keep the thorns in his back from overwhelming his senses, and soon it became a dull pain in the back of his mind. Shadows continued to take over his thoughts, that and the smell. Because of the lack of sunlight this deep into the cove, the rainfall might have been a welcome respite from the scorching sun. Instead, it filled cracks and eddies in the rock before turning fetid. He wrinkled his nose as he stepped in a slimy pool, catching the whiff of an unmistakable smell. The guard station latrine. He was finally home. "Hey-ho, Taraj!" he shouted in his native tongue, the ancient dialect spoken almost exclusively by the elders of the clan. 3 guards were stationed at Sunset Cove. Sunve Lone Breath, the eldest of the 3, and the one that had first volunteered to protect the cove, Cardaw Thunderdraft, who was a decade older than Scarhoof, but had only been there a year, and himself. They were his tribe, more so than the rest of the village they were sworn to protect. 3 soldiers past their prime, continuing to serve. "Hey-ho, Taraj!" he called again, waiting for the proper reply before approaching. His shout echoed off the walls with an unsettling reverberation. He cautioned a couple steps forward. The floor was slick, and he put out a hand to steady himself. He instantly withdrew it when he felt something wet and slimy. This was his home, where he spent most of his time, but something wasn't right. It made his mane stand on edge. "Hello?" They should have replied by now. He was just outside the cut in the rock where the guards lived. What was going on? Something dire was happening, but he couldn't put his finger on it. There was no light. There was always a lantern hung on the wall, yet tonight there was none. Where had it gone? He took another step forward, and his hoof banged into something on the ground. It rattled away, and the distinctive metallic rattle revealed what he had kicked, the missing lantern. His fur bristled, his dark mane standing out on his neck and back. Something was wrong. Where are the guards? That's when he heard the moan. It was a painful, pleading cry for help. His health was halfway down, and he tossed 2 minning forces on himself for good measure. He couldn't have the pain of the barbs in his back worming its way into his already adrenaline-filled mind. Avoiding the lantern, he stepped into the rocky doorway. A metallic pile hung in the air, like when they slaughtered the pigs once a year. He peeked through the hewn doorway. 4 bodies lay on the ground. 2 of them were Taraj. One lay horns up with a stricken expression on his pallid face, the other horns down. Neither moved. The other 2 were difficult to place at first, but the shimmering blue scales gave it away. He was suddenly very aware of his rapid breathing, and his tail swishing back and forth. His friends lay on the ground right in front of him. He wasn't here to help them when they most needed him. Guilt and terror gripped his insides, twisting his innards at the grisly sight. Remain focused. Scar, investigate. He pulled his weapon from its holster and held it at the ready. First he checked the dead Nagos to ensure they were no threat. The large bodies were easily the same size as his, if not larger. The first one's head was nearly severed from its puncture-riddled body. Alright guys, that was Eloria's Beginning. That was by Tom Hansen. I really enjoyed reading that. This is the first LitRPG that I've read that does not have a human protagonist, and I was actually very interested with the story because I don't know where it's going, which I like. So now I'm going to go ahead and switch to Martyrs by Justin Lincoln. And I'm actually going to just go ahead and take a drink of beer just because I'm a little thirsty. Alright, Chapter 1, The Village. With false bravado, James stepped into the capsule that was to be his new home for the first few months. After a polite greeting, the military doctor who oversaw his care got right to work. Her skin was tan and leathery, suggesting that she didn't always practice medicine indoors. She moved with a silent diligence as she connected man to machine with various electrodes, cords, and tubes. As the doctor worked, the only sounds in the surgical rooms were of James's breath and the occasional tink of a hard rubber cord hitting the metal capsule. Theoretically, the capsule he was inside would allow him to play a fully immersive virtual reality game. The game itself was in beta, and James was supposed to test the technology. He recalled how the military recruiters had said everything was safe, but that fact wasn't giving him any comfort now that he was being hooked up to an assortment of intimidating medical systems. "We're all set to go," said the doctor. "All that's left is put you to sleep and have you wake up in the game. Once you're asleep, I will put this feeding tube into your mouth and hook up a catheter. Rest assured, you'll be completely nourished, clean, and safe." Her cheeks rose as she spoke, her mouth struggling to form a smile between each word. James nodded and gave her a wink, more to convince himself that he wasn't scared than to convince her. Laying his head back, James swallowed his growing panic. What else did they tell me? James wasn't rich by any means. In fact, he and his little brother had been struggling to survive since their parents' deaths, which had happened when James was a young teenager and his brother a preteen. They were both adults now and finally getting on their feet. James figured that his childhood was the reason he had jumped so quickly at this opportunity. So quickly, in fact, that even though the doctors had prepared him for this moment, he couldn't remember a word they had said aside from their promise that they would let his brother enter the game soon after him. James had been adamant about that part. It was one thing to be blinded by money, but no amount of it would make him forget about his brother. They had been through so much together, and he would be damned if they didn't do this together as well. Ready? 3, 2, the doctor counted. James was out before she could finish. Scene break. James woke up in a field of tall grass and said the first thing that came to his mind. What the what? He briefly examined himself and realized he was still in the same body, 23 years old, 175 pounds, and standing at 6 foot even. After a few moments of waving his hands in the air and poking at himself, he discovered that there was no pixelation, no laggy graphics when he moved his head too fast, and more importantly, all his senses seemed to be working correctly. He was the same person, just someplace completely different from where he had been moments ago. That someplace different happened to be someplace beautiful. The calmer he kept his body, the more aspects of this new place he noticed. James froze and opened his senses to the world. A bright blue streak soared through the air as the smell of freshly grown peace of mind politely assaulted his nose. The blue streak disappeared into the tall grass and emerged seconds later with something in its beak. It spotted James and hovered in midair. The bird was blurry, as if James's eyes refused to recognize it. He could only make out its blue color, and he guessed this was probably a defense mechanism for the bird. When it flew away, it faded from view long before it left James's range of sight. What to do, James said as he probed his face with his hands. Well, I guess there's no need for a character selection screen. What about a tutorial? He shrugged his shoulders and set off in a random direction. The flat ground that was covered in shoulder-height grass, which Jason soon decided to call the Big Savannah, seemed to stretch on forever in all directions. The grass caressed his exposed skin as he walked, causing his legs and forearms to tingle. As he parted it with his hands and prepared to take another step, a commotion somewhere in the distance reached his ears, giving him pause. He jumped to get a snippet of the action, but all he managed to see was the grass shaking and swaying unnaturally. Either something big is over there, or this game has some weird weather patterns, he thought. As James strode towards the noise as quietly as he could, a text box appeared in front of his vision, accompanied by an audible ding. You have learned the sneak ability. After he read it, the text box traveled to the upper right corner of his vision. He tried to follow it with his head. However, the box was an overlay. The closer it got to James's peripherals, the faster he had to move his head to follow it, until his body twisted into a knot and he lay in a heap. Smooth, James told himself before noticing the word skills in his peripheral vision. It was like someone had tattooed the word in white ink where the outermost reaches of his vision darkened and went black. He unfocused and refocused his eyes, and was relieved to learn that the words wouldn't bother him as he went about his life. Well, that's convenient. Now, how do I access it? No sooner had he spoken these words than a translucent skills tab appeared in front of him. The message inside the nature-encrusted border showed him that he had acquired a skill called Sneak. Other than its level 1, the tab didn't provide any information about the skill. As James was getting a feel for his interface, an intense glow snapped his attention back to the moment. I guess this place does have normal weather patterns, he quipped. James slowly extended to his full height and saw two animals fighting. One looked almost like a lion. Fur the same pale gold of the savanna grass stretched thinly over its muscular body. Its beast-like face had a remarkably human-like expression of panic plastered on it. Lion Guy struggled to fight off a reptilian creature which had a height advantage of at least a foot over the lion, and which was 50 pounds heavier. James's heart beat a frenzied tune as he tried to soak up the surreal situation before him. Name tags appeared above the creatures, as if to remind James that he was just in a game. Lion Guy and Lizard Dude, they read. Are those their names, or did I name them with my thoughts? Damn, I really should try to be more creative, James thought out loud, causing Lizard Dude to turn and look at him. Crap, he said, smacking his hand over his mouth, as if he could shove his words back inside. Lizard Dude's long body ripped with muscle as it dug its claws into the ground. The fangs in its small mouth glinted in the sunlight as the lizard hissed. James shuddered as it measured him and loomed over him, even from afar. Then the reptilian pounced, and everything went dark. Scene break again. James awoke from a slumber, confused and alarmed. This is just a game, he reminded himself. The words caught in his throat as his body came alive with pain. He squirmed against the soft pile of furs below him and grasped at his chest. A mixture of blood and green paste covered his hands. His eyes searched for gauze, a tourniquet, or even duct tape, but the floor of the tent was empty apart from the scattering of fur piles. James laid his head back and tried to focus on anything other than his agony. Are these beds? He prodded the pile of furs. I must be in someone's living quarters. James' brief mental respite ended when his wound screamed out for attention once again. He clutched his chest. Arg! They weren't lying when they said this game would feel real. James attempted to stand, reminding his pain that it had the rest of his body to roam. He must have let out a scream as Lion Guy came walking through the entrance of the tent a moment later. James finally stood, this time ignoring his injuries as he prepared to defend himself. Lion Guy was about the same size as James, but the golden brown fur covering his body made him seem slightly more substantial. His half-beast, half-human features twisted in an unrecognizable expression as he walked towards James on his two back legs. His next expression was much easier to read. It was a smile, but not one worn by a happy person. Lion Guy crouched, leaped, and tackled James, knocking him over a pile of furs with a grunt. Excuse me. Why are you doing this? James yelled as he struggled to fend off the beast and cover his wounds at the same time. He swung at the creature, but it dodged his blow and gave him another smile. Enough! A voice boomed. James and Lion Guy both cowered in fear as the light shining through the tent flap went out. A mammoth of a creature stepped inside, dwarfing James and Lion Guy. It was the same breed as Lion Guy, but was about 4 times his size. It had an impressive and terrifying presence. Is that a minotaur? James thought, taking a better look at Lion Guy. His feet looked half beast and half human. Definitely not a lion's paw. A name tag appeared above the head of the giant creature as it made its way inside. Super Mega Lion. Suddenly, Lion Guy let out a growl and charged Super Mega Lion. His signature move of tackling his prey proved ineffective against the massive creature, and he soon found himself picked up and thrown over his shoulder. Super Mega Lion stroked the fur of Lion Guy's back, and he purred like a kitten. James did his best to express how he was feeling at the moment. What is going on here? Super Mega Lion stopped petting Lion Guy and looked at James. Her face formed an expression that was easy to recognize. She was surprised. You can speak, little cub? Super Mega Lion asked, in a principally feminine tone. Her actual speech was rough and deep, but if you listened carefully, you could hear a thin layer of gentleness coat its edges. Of course I can speak. Who are you? Are you going to kill me or what? Why are you petting him? James let the confusion and pain he had experienced over the past few hours unravel into a tornado of questions and emotions. Then it dawned on him. She called him a cub. The feminine voice. You are Lion Guy's mother? My name is Fridis. You may call me Frey. And this is my cub, Torun. Frey responded as she continued to stroke her cub's back. We are martyrs. You are a guest of mine, and you have my thanks for saving Torun from an attack by an Oana. They are a plague to our lands, and he would have died if you hadn't shown up, Frey explained. Wait, so Oana are the lizard creatures that were attacking your cub, whose name is Torun, and your race is called the Martyrs? James confirmed with hesitant eyes. Frey nodded her large head, which was like a giant boulder that couldn't decide whether to jump off an even larger boulder. Well, I didn't do much. Torun seemed to be holding his own. We are not a weak race, but Torun is not yet fully grown, which brings me to my next concern. You are not either, she said flatly. How are you able to talk at such a young age? What? I am an adult of my race, James said, astounded at both the insult and the fact it had come from a construct of the game. The Martyrs didn't seem to be like any non-player character, or NPC for short, James had ever encountered before. Her mannerisms and the way she conversed were more than realistic. I am familiar with humans, and you are the same size as the human cubs that I have seen, she said without an ounce of malice in her tone. She was either genuinely ignorant, or James was. Deciding that arguing with the giant creature wasn't in his best interest, James changed the subject. Can you tell me where I can clean up and how I can heal this wound? Yes, but first you must understand some things about my clan. You are my guest, but no one else knows you are here. I suspect my mate will not be happy that I brought a human into our village, even if you're only a cub, Frey explained. James sighed at the cub comment, but let her continue. I will talk with my mate at sunset. You must remain here until I do. Frey reached a long arm outside the tent. When she pulled it back and a green poultice covered her fingertips, she put this on your wound, and then do not touch it. You will heal in less than an hour. James did as the female martyr suggested. She then stood up, placed Torun back on the ground, and began the arduous task of exiting the tent. The martyr cub stared at James for a while before giving another mischievous grin. Uh-oh, James whispered. Before he could get tackled again, he shot out his hands in a stopping motion and yelled, No! Bad! He let out a sigh of relief when the martyr cub stopped, but he felt guilty when Torun's ears wilted. Torun pouted as he walked to a pile of furs on which he promptly fell asleep. Effectively alone in the house-sized tent, James decided to explore. Random piles of fur lay scattered across the matted dirt floor, and an unlit fire pit sat in the center of the tent. Some dead animals were piled up the back end of the tent. James had initially mistaken them for a fur pile and had almost sat on them, but then noticed a snout sticking out. He moved closer to make sense of it all. There were 2 large boar-like creatures and one of the few tall birds that resembled man-sized flamingos. All of them were varying shades of brown. James surmised their similar color schemes were for camouflage in the big savannah. A bunch of good that did ya, he whispered. James had been hunting a few times when he was a teenager, and even though these creatures were alien to him, he felt sorry for them. The feeling only lasted a second, though. He kept reminding himself that this was just a game. He understood the need to hunt for sustenance, but the realism of the pile of animals tugged at his heartstrings. He had played other games where he needed to kill animals, even other people, but such games had never elicited an emotional response like this. In fact, he had murdered entire villages of humanoids in other games just for the sake of grinding or leveling up, and he had never felt a thing. Looking the pile of dead animals over, James noticed a small sword on the ground next to them. Well, this is a game after all. I should see if I can gain a skill or something. Scene break. A few hours later, the sun began its descent. James had skinned and chopped up the animals he had found, and he had even started a fire the old-fashioned way. He pulled a pile of furs close to the fire to sit on. Then he found a stick on which to roast a piece of meat. James let out a sigh of relief now that his wound had healed and he could relax by a fire with some food. This game isn't too bad, he thought. James decided to play with his interface again to see if he had learned any skills. He relaxed his vision, and the skills tab appeared to his upper left, while a new exclamation point flashed to his bottom right. He focused his mind on the exclamation point, and a text box appeared with some prompts. Oana Scout activates Pounce. 20 damage received. Your body has gone into shock from receiving too much damage. Oana Scout activates Maim. 30 damage received. You have passed out from receiving too much damage. You have learned the skinning ability. Prompts move to the notification section upon your request. You have learned the cooking ability. You have learned fire mastery. Congratulations, you have cooked charred plains boar meat. Cooking increased to level 2. Awesome. James did not understand why he had passed out from receiving damage, but was happy that the interface adapted itself to his needs and hadn't covered his vision. As he perused his growing skills tab, failing to find more information about his abilities, Frey entered the tent. Her eyes bounced from the fire to James and back to the fire again before she walked to the area where the recently hunted animals used to lay. You continue to surprise me, man-cub, Frey said with a deep intrigue as she joined James by the fire. I figure I would help out while I was here. Oh, and I got hungry. Sorry. Food is of no concern. Those beasts are plentiful in the Great Savannah. Annoying, even, and if tonight goes as planned, you'll be able to repay us. The fire, however, that is fascinating. James smirked at the Martyrs' name for the big savannah. His guess hadn't been that far off. James decided he would call it the Great Savannah as the residents did from now on. What do you mean? He inquired. Fire, only our elder can create it, she explained. James thought that was an odd fact, but he meant to inquire about the plan for tonight, not the fire or why only an elder could rub two sticks together. When James asked about this, Frey quickly glanced up at him as if his question interrupted her from a long-lost thought. Well, she began, I will announce the clan and my mate that I am adopting you as my cub. They may not like it, but I do not see a more honorable way to repay you for saving my little Tarun. It was still awkward for James to hear someone call Tarun, who was the size of a grown man, a cub. James wasn't even sure he wanted to be someone's cub. It seemed inappropriate, and he had no idea what would be required of him. Then James realized that he had no idea what the game required of him at all. He surmised that it might be a smart, short-term decision to have Frey available to look out for him, at the very least just long enough for him to get his bearings. Okay, what do I need to do? James asked. Nothing. Despite your apparent abilities, the clan will still consider you a cub. Explaining to the rest of the village that you can somehow talk is a battle for another day. Soon a horn will sound, signaling the start of the day's feast. Suddenly a sound rumbled through the air, so deep it made James glance around for the nearest restroom. Ah, there it is. Stay here until I call for you, she said as she carefully exited the tent. James crawled to the edge of the tent and slipped just enough of his head under the flap to see outside. Martyrs, some of them were even larger than Frey, were walking about. They gathered around a fire pit large enough for James to do cartwheels in. Other tents circled it like large tan rhinos, keeping warm for the night. The moon radiated through the clear night sky, casting a dull glow on everything and reflecting off the creatures' belt buckles. A dark red maple hut stood above them all, slightly contrasting with the sea of browns. Carvings and symbols adorned the walls, and its large opening faced the fire, covered by a flap made from the same hide of the tents. The flap moved, and James's breath caught in his throat when he saw what emerged from the hut. Chapter 2. The Chieftain. Dring, the clan leader, sat on his chair and waited for the feast to begin. He thought back on how far his village had come. They had started as a small handful of martyrs on the run from the Oana. On the run after the Oana had destroyed their homeland. He was still a young cub in those days, but he wished he could have done more. Drink smiled, remembering how strong he had been for his age, but the emotion quickly turned to rage when he recalled how little good it had done him. He would never forget watching his noble race get slaughtered like bison bogs. The bloodshed was truly unimaginable. In fact, he soberly remembered wondering why there had seemed to be more blood than physically possible, more than everyone who was present had in their bodies combined. Put simply, it was an extra bloody day. It was only when Dreg reached adulthood and when his small band of survivors founded the village that he got an answer. Frode, his companion during the Exodus and later his mentor and elder, revealed the martyr secret. The clan horn sounded, temporarily interrupting the chieftain's thoughts. He had a special appreciation for that horn. He recalled the titan of a creature from which he had stolen it. The Abominator was nearly 3 times the size of an adult martyr. When Drang had finally discovered its location, he went to kill it despite his father's concerns. He couldn't just stand idle as the Abominator ate his clansmen. He smiled as he recalled the difficulty he had ripping the horn from the creature's head. Everyone who blew the horn got a sense of that difficulty. Only the strongest martyrs could gather enough wind to sound it. Drang shook his head to refocus, but quickly fell back into his ruminations, as old martyrs often did. He had done well to rebuild his homeland, but there was still much more that needed to be accomplished. He had realized months ago that he would not be the one to lead his village into a full rebound, but he was only now accepting it for the first time. Chief, the feast awaits, Frood prompted his chieftain and adopted cub. Frood had spent many years by Drang's side. He was a decade older than the chieftain, but had no desire to lead the remaining members of his noble race. Even if he did, he didn't have the ability. Frode's strength came from his wisdom, and wisdom didn't get you far during frequent ambushes and night raids. For those, you needed an innate affinity for violence, and that would allow you to summon all your strength and defend yourself at a moment's call, even when coming out of a dead sleep. You needed strength and a high constitution. You needed everything Dring had in spades. He was a clear leader and had assumed the role without much dissent from his elders or peers. The remaining martyrs had been familiar with Dring's strength as a cub. Those who didn't automatically assume he deserved to be the clan's leader for that fact alone were reminded of his worth every day during their exodus. Tring wasn't only unnaturally strong for martyr, but he could also think 2 steps ahead in any fight. On the first few days of the exodus, the misfit band of survivors watched Dring as he made dramatic moves that allowed them to escape and survive another day. Weeks later, his elders followed his commands in the heat of battle. Had they been too stubborn or prideful, or had Dring's leadership faltered in any way, the survivors would not have made it to where they were today. But they did. Frode's race was wise, intelligent, and fearsome. His leader was talented, loved, and a real fright on the battlefield. It was a shame his race had been nearly killed off. Yes, my friend, let us join our people, Dring announced. Side by side, the 2 aging martyrs left the hut and descended a small slope that led to the fire pit and their people. Dring had fought, bled, and crawled into the mud with his people, so he did not require any fanfare or celebration upon his arrival. He was undoubtedly everyone's leader, but more importantly, he was one of them. Dring looked at his people, crossed his arms across his broad chest in a Martyrian salute, and the feast began. Soon, Freydis stood and approached the fire, as was customary when a clansman had an announcement to make. Dring nodded at her, a gesture which told most people it was their turn to speak, but which told Freydis much more. Dring's nod said to her that he cared for her. The simple movement held a lifetime of love and appreciation. It contained an appreciation for how she stood by him and for their shared determination to rebuild their race, and it showed appreciation that she had survived the Exodus. Today, an Oana scout attacked our cub, Freydis began abruptly. The martyr snarled in disgust at the mention of the race that had destroyed their homeland. The chieftain watched as his mate nodded at her clansmen and raised a giant hand to quiet them. Tarun fought bravely, but I fear that if he had not been saved, he would have fallen. Dring's eyebrows rose at her announcement. Oana attacks were common. Sometimes even fully grown members of his clan were lost to them, but what surprised him was that Freydis thought their son could have been lost. He believed his son was stronger than most fully grown martyrs, and undoubtedly smarter. He didn't believe just one Oana scout could be a danger to their son. It is important that we prepare for an imminent attack, but I have another more important announcement, Freydis said before pausing. Dring watched in anticipation of his mate's ability to address the clan. He found himself leaning closer when she began to speak again. I have brought back with me Tarun's savior, a man-cub. What? Dring explained as he stood from his chair, forcefully enough to send it skittering across the dirt behind him. I will take him under my care, and I hereby announce him my cub. Our cub, Freydis calmly stated, meeting Dring's gaze. I will have none of it, Dring announced as he stalked toward Freydis, who braced herself against the incoming attack. She knew she would have to defend her decision with blood, but did not count on Dring getting so angry. She must have caught him on a bad day. It would make the fight more difficult. He was the strongest of their race, but what Frey lacked in strength she made up for in speed. Dring swung at her. Predictable, she thought. Leave it to the war leader to strike first. Freitas rolled to the side and popped back to her feet, successfully dodging the blow aimed at her face. She prepared to counter-strike, but couldn't find her mate. Fear pulsed through her body as she realized his attack was not as predictable as she thought. Dring knew what she would think, and had managed to anticipate the direction that she would dodge and somehow maneuver behind her. As she contemplated the genius of her mate's combat ability, her fears were confirmed, and she was lifted off her feet. In a terrifying show of strength, Dring launched her into the air. Everyone watching held their breath. Chapter 3. Wisdom Strategy. What the what? James whispered to himself. He tried to replay in his head what had just happened. First, a huge-ass lion dude, the biggest he had seen so far, comes out of the hut. Second, everybody eats, and Frey starts saying something to the other villagers. Then finally, the huge-ass lion dude doesn't seem to like what Frey says and proceeds to whoop her ass. James was astonished that the huge-ass lion dude would so casually beat his mate like that. He was even more astounded that no one was doing anything about it. He glanced around as he waited to see when Frey would come down from the wicked toss. He honestly thought that she might have grasped onto a nearby tree. Maybe she's too afraid to come down. He's going to catch her, right? James said to the pile of furs that covered the sleeping Tarun. Tarun didn't move an inch, nor did the rhythm of his soft snoring break. Little cub is sleeping so good he doesn't even realize his parents are about to get a divorce, James laughed. An eternity later, Frey smashed into the ground, leaving a small crater and showering the area with the disturbed dirt. She slowly stood up and let out a roar that covered James's flesh in goosebumps. Her fur took on a red tinge, and she closed the distance between her and her mate in a heartbeat. The two were locked in battle, trading swipes that were so fast James struggled to see who had the upper hand. He pressed his head further out of the tent and focused. Time seemed to slow, just in time for him to see the flesh on Frey's back part. A lightning bolt pattern formed on Frey's right shoulder, exposing her raw muscle. The wounds ceased to grow when they reached her lower back. She landed a devastating strike on Dring's face. He stood stock still and stared at Frey, who was still seething with anger. Dring took a knee, signifying his defeat, and spoke. Very well, my beloved Freitas. I will honor the wisdom of your request. Man cub, Frey called out, rage still racking her body. Crap, that's my cue, James thought as he shrunk back into the tent and made for the actual exit. He put on his false bravado and tried to muster a respectful gait. When he arrived next to Frey, he stared at Dring in astonishment. Oh man, if Frey's a mammoth, then this guy must be an actual god. Straight out of Mount Olympus, James thought, wondering when his little brother would enter the game so he could have someone to appreciate his sense of humor. And then a tingle from somewhere he couldn't explain interrupted his musings. His eyes shot to Dring. I, Dring, chieftain of the clan of honor, savior of the sole remaining members of the martyr race, accept you as our cub, Dring recited. He then placed a single massive finger on James's chest. Dring closed his eyes, and James could feel a painless and sudden drop in temperature. The exclamation point in his lower right came to life and shouted for his attention with angry blinks. Not trusting himself to respond appropriately, James just nodded respectfully at the chieftain. He briefly considered giving a speech to try and make a good impression on the chieftain, but figured it would be too risky. The thought of him gracefully accepting the chieftain's gift with a short and captivating sentence or two sounded good in theory, but James didn't think he was a skilled enough orator to pull it off. Besides, Freitas had warned him that the Martyrs would not react well if they found out he could talk. We have much to discuss, my beloved Freitas, and you have much explaining to do, Dring said with finality. Frey whisked James away, back into the same tent he had just spent the entire day inside. Indignant about being shoved back into his jail tent, James could only think of one response. Nobody puts baby in the corner. Scene break. James woke up the next morning to the sounds of a rooster. Seriously? You create an entire fantasy universe and still include fucking roosters? He groggily complained. His raised voice didn't seem to disturb any of the full-grown martyrs sleeping in the tent, but it did arouse some of the less mature ones. Tarun heard the commotion and perked up immediately. He raised his head like a prairie dog from the pile of furs where he just spent the last 14 hours and scanned the room. Across the fire pit, he saw the man-cub leave the tent. Tarun could see that James now carried the imprint of the martyr. Always one to seize an opportunity, Tarun snuck away to hunt his brother. James carefully stepped out of the tent and realized no martyr villagers were present. They must be late sleepers. Cock-a-doodle-doo, the rooster repeated. The sound came from the west, or at least James assumed it was the west. It could have easily been the opposite in the game world. There weren't any other humans around to compare with, though, so he didn't see the point in pursuing the issue. James started sneaking in the direction of the god-awful noise. When he rounded the outermost tent, which took a while since they were so large, he noticed the rooster was not a rooster at all. It was one of those brown flamingo beasts like the one he had skinned and eaten the day before. Prepare to meet your maker, James thought, cognizant of the fact that talking in sneak mode was a bad idea. Just as he was about to pull out the skinning sword from his brown cotton pants, the earth came up and punched him in the face. What happened? James whined as he rolled onto his back. He reached up to cover his bleeding nose. The pain told him that it was broken. That was when he saw it. Tarun's little grin. You little, James started to say as he stood up and ran at his adopted game brother. Tarun's ears perked up, and the smile on his face quickly died. Then Tarun did what little brothers have been doing since the beginning of time. He booked it. Got out of Dodge, ran like there was no tomorrow. James gave chase in the direction of the flamingo rooster. Tarun was fast, but James kept pace until they were deep into the great savannah, the village barely visible on the horizon. James's anger faded as he used it to fuel his determination. They ran for what felt like an eternity, long enough, in fact, for James's nose to heal, no doubt due to some in-game health recovery mechanic. Finally, James spotted his opportunity. A sizable fallen branch was lying dead ahead in their path. Tarun slowed just enough so he could prepare to leap over the branch, but James did not. Instead, he jumped into the air without slowing. He straightened his body in midair until it was parallel to the ground. His body formed a perfect spear, and his hair rippled in the wind. Tarun's back became a target, and James became a missile. Moments later, his shoulder impacted Tarun, resulting in a panicked yelp. The two game brothers landed in a heap and rolled apart, dissolving into fits of laughter that made it difficult for James to crawl forward and continue his attack. Likewise, it made it difficult for Tarun to run away. As they lay there, laughing and trying to catch their breath, James heard a noise that allowed him a glimpse of the absolute rage Frey must have felt when she unleashed her terrible power. Cock-a-doodle-doo! James propped himself up into a crouch and looked over to Tarun, who was already in the same position. They nodded to each other and opened their senses to the surrounding land. Cock-a-doodle-doo! That was it. They now knew the direction of their prey. James quietly pulled out his skinning sword at the same moment Tarun pounced away on all fours. James followed him in silent pursuit. When James arrived at a small clearing where he had last heard the noise, he saw Tarun locked in battle, not with one flamingo rooster, but with a whole flock of them. He watched as his brother dodged, swiped, rolled, and swiped again with ferocity. James could see, though, that they would soon overwhelm him. They were backing Tarun up towards a small lake where James assumed they would have the advantage. Not today, you little XP carriers, not today. James gave himself to the game, letting out his best impression of a war scream as he charged. He swung his blade at the first flamingo rooster he met and left a 1-inch gash in its back. James could see his game brother's face harden at his reprieve, and they both picked up the pace. James slashed, Tarun swiped, and the flamingo roosters pecked. The battle seemed easy now that they had the creatures surrounded. That was until one of the flamingo roosters finally landed a peck on James's shoulder. He cried out in pain and looked over at the wound. A cone of flesh was missing from his shoulder. His eyes glazed over. In real life, he could count on one hand the number of times he had gotten injured this severely. The in-game pain was indistinguishable from real-life pain. Worse yet, it was James's sword hand, and the shoulder wound made it impossible for James to lift his sword. James attempted to switch the sword to his other hand, but he fumbled it. As he bent over to pick it up, Tarun flew over him like a majestic missile. Tarun's fur rippled in the wind, saliva trailed from his grin, and with flawless execution, he tackled the flamingo rooster that was sneaking up on James. As James recovered, he realized what his game brother had done, and he joined him in battle with the final flamingo rooster. Working together, they surrounded it and dispatched it easily, its long skinny legs collapsing as it fell to the ground. As soon as the final flamingo rooster completed its dramatic death throes, the ground underneath James and Tarun began to quake. Behind them, they heard something disturb the water. They both turned around just in time to see a giant flamingo rooster rise from the small pond. What the what? Is this a boss monster? James said, a little worried about how they would fare against it since he was fighting with his non-dominant arm and the other was useless. Tarun didn't have the same reservations, though, and charged the considerable beast. James took a second to read its name tag. Final flamingo rooster, James sighed. He would need to find an ability that would allow him to learn the real names of the monsters he came across. Tarun closed the distance quickly and engaged the boss monster. James flanked it. The martyr cub was an agile tank, keeping the boss engaged but dodging most of its blows. This strategy allowed James to get behind it. He paused for a moment and had a thought. Then he crouched and snuck up to the back of the monster. With an awkward stab, he drove his sword deep into the unsuspecting flamingo rooster. It bellowed in pain and turned to face James. Before it could attack, Tarun pounced on it, climbed up onto its head, and sunk his teeth into its neck. The final bite, coupled with James's sneak attack, was too much for the final flamingo rooster, and it fell onto the shore of the small pond. Whew, James said, and gave his game brother a respectful nod, which Tarun returned in a surprising show of intelligence. Then James let out a sigh of relief. twirled his blade around, and began to skin all the kills with it. The skinning was difficult at first, but got more comfortable as James's shoulder healed. When he was nearly finished, he piled the furs away from the water and started on the boss monster. As his sword sliced through the thin layer of connective tissue between the monster's skin and muscle, he noticed something underneath the beast. Excited at the chance of possible loot, he called Tarun over, and they lifted the creature onto its side. A satchel lay there, partly squished into the mud. James grabbed it, and a notification appeared. You have received an adventurous satchel. James equipped the bag. The prompt in his vision minimized and traveled to his upper right peripherals, where it stopped and transformed into the word inventory. Yes, James exclaimed, startling Tarun, who seemed to be sniffing some herbs nearby. James couldn't tell if his game brother was inspecting them or looking for a good spot to mark his territory. At the moment, he didn't care. James mentally reached out to his inventory menu, and a transparent grid appeared. It had a seemingly never-ending number of slots for items. The only one currently occupied was taken up by a necklace. James decided he would inspect it later. He was more curious about the bag's capabilities right now. He walked over to his vast pile of furs and unslung the bag from his back. He loosened the drawstring so the opening was as wide as it would go. James then stuck the collection of furs into the bag. It didn't seem to grow any larger as he worked. When he reassessed his inventory, he saw it now contained 9 Ingo furs, each taking up a single slot. James idly wondered why they didn't stack in one slot like in most games, but realized it wasn't a big deal since the bag didn't seem to have a maximum capacity. Well, that's one way to learn a creature's name, James murmured to himself. It's much easier to say than Flamingo Rooster. James finished skinning the boss Ingo and received 10 more skins as a reward for his work, bringing his total to 19. He would have gotten more, but he wasn't used to the boss's tougher skin, and so he had ruined some of the pelts. James then butchered the animals and received 40 pieces of Ingo meat, which he added to the bag. Ready to set off for the village, he scoured the area for Tarun, who he found resting a few paces out of the clearing. James joined his brother, who was, on closer inspection, mashing herbs together in his hand like a makeshift mortar and pestle. Tarun stood up and smiled. James braced himself, but Tarun, instead of tackling James, reached out with his empty hand and placed it on his shoulder. The martyr cub then presented his other hand, which was full of mashed herbs, and looked at James questioningly. The mixture seemed a lot like the green paste Frey had used to heal his wounds the day before. James nodded, and Tarun applied the mix to his shoulder. The two then set off for home. Scene break. James and Tarun returned to the village without any problems. James's wound had healed long before they reached the village, thanks to Tarun's paste. On the way back, James struggled with direction, but his half-animal brother instinctively knew the way. When they arrived, the villagers were all awake and were stomping around, completing various tasks. They didn't pay much attention to James as he walked into the village, which he thought was excellent. He did receive the occasional glance, but for the most part, they treated him like the other cubs of the village, which were all scampering about, doing their own thing. James noticed one unusually small cub, about the size of a human teenager, almost fall into a well. The closest adult martyr simply picked it up by the scruff of its neck and placed it away from the well before going on about her business. James got the feeling the parenting roles were loose here, and that the whole village looked out for and raised the clan's cubs. Entering their tent, Tarun jumped into his pile of furs and soon passed out. James settled into his pile and started a fire to cook some of his Ingo meat. He remembered wishing that he wouldn't get hungry in the game, but now he was happy about the feeling. Eating was comforting. It provided him with some familiarity with the real world and kept him grounded. Besides, this batch of meat tasted substantially better than the last. A short while later, Frey lumbered into the tent and pulled up a pile of furs next to the fire. She let out a sigh of relief as she leaned back and stared off into the flames. James figured the ability for people to sit by a fire and silently bond must have been a universal truth. He often did just that with his closest friends in the real world, not that he had many. It was a nice change of pace for the game and made him feel even more relaxed. He decided this was a good time to check his notifications. Congratulations, you have earned the new Martyr level 1. Sneak increased to level 2. Short swords increased to level 4. Ingo activates Peck, 10 damage received. You have performed a sneak attack for 30 damage. Congratulations, you have reached level 2. Character points available to spend. Skinning increased to level 6. Fire increased to level 2. Congratulations, you have cooked perfect Ingo meat. Cooking increased to level 3. James dismissed the prompts about the Ingo skins. The mark he received must have been found when Dring shot the power through his body the night prior. He decided that he needed to do some investigating and get some useful information from his interface for a change. There was so much he didn't know, including how much health he had, what his statistic points like endurance affected, and how his skills and character gained Experience. James focused on his skills tab and noticed it changed to a status tab. It now contained more information, but not all the information he needed. His stat points were now listed, as were his equipped items, but there was no description for any of them. He pulled his inventory bag to learn more about the necklace he received when he killed the Ingo boss. No details presented themselves, so he hung the necklace over his head. Clarity overcame his body seconds later. Cobwebs that must have gathered in the deep reaches of his brain were all suddenly burnt away in a flash. He couldn't put his finger on the specific change, but he knew he felt better, sharper. A prompt appeared in the center of his vision. Congratulations, your intelligence has surpassed level 10. You can now gather more information from your interface. Now we're talking, James said out loud. He quickly glanced at Tarun to see if his sudden outburst had woken the cub, but the pile of furs remained motionless. Freitas, however, did react and didn't seem too happy that James had broke the enchanting silence. James whispered an apology. When Freitas drifted back off into her thoughts, James pulled up his status tab. He now had pronounced and detailed tabs on his menu. He took a moment to look at every entry and focused on bringing up additional details. Statistics, James, level 2. Constitution, level 6. Controls how much health you have. Strength, level 4. Affects your size and your ability to use weapons and lift objects. Endurance, level 5. Controls how much endurance you have. Agility, level 4. Controls your movement abilities in battle, dodges and critical strikes, and unarmed combat damage. Will, level 4. Controls how low your HP can drop before you go into shock, and more. Intelligence, level 13. Controls the data you can gather from your interface, the world, and more. Wisdom, level 2. Controls the rate at which you gain character experience, and more. Health, 60. Endurance, 50. Two statistic points ready to distribute. Awesome. Wisdom can make me gain extra experience, James mumbled. He decided he should focus on increasing that statistic so he could level faster, while second priority should be raising his intelligence. That way, he could get a boost of experience from wisdom and could leverage his intelligence to learn more about what each stat did. Once he got a feel for how things worked, he would revisit his strategy. He was a little disappointed that he had only received 2 stat points to distribute upon leveling up, but he shrugged it away and dumped them both into wisdom, bringing it up to level 4. After a quick calculation, he also realized that his health and endurance points were both 10 times their controlling stats. 6 Constitution gave him 60 health points, and an endurance of 5 granted him 50 endurance points. He noted the red health bar, the green energy bar at the bottom of his peripherals, and continued digging into the menu. Skills, Sneak, level 2. Visibility and sound decreased by 2% while sneaking. Skinning, level 6. Time to skin and error rate decreased by 6% while skinning. Cooking, level 3. Food is 3% more delicious. Stat buffs for meals that award them increased by 3%. Fire, level 2. Your mastery of fire increased by 2%. Short swords, level 4. Damage done with short swords increased by 4%. James noticed that everything in this tab, besides his fire mastery, was straightforward. He wondered what fire mastery did for him exactly. A quick search through his menu didn't yield any further information. Guess I'll have to wait until I increase my intelligence for that one, James noted. He also predicted that big things would happen after you surpass level 10 in a skill or stat. When his intelligence exceeded level 10, a good deal of beneficial information was unlocked. It was possible that he would get other useful abilities when things reached level 10. James's eyes grew heavy, and he leaned back onto his furs until he was utterly prone. He wanted to get through the last 2 menus, but sleep took him before he had the chance. Scene break. A horn sounded and violently woke James from his nap. He wiped the sand from his eyes and stretched before being bombarded with an excited Tarun. The martyr cub jumped up and down, presumably signaling that he wanted to eat. So you like eating more than you like sleeping, huh, Tarun? James asked as he followed the cub out of the tent. He was unsure of how to join the feast, but Tarun simply led him to the nearest open seat and motioned for him to take it. Some comparatively smaller adult martyrs brought out the food. It looked like roasted Ingo meat with vegetables that James had never seen before. The chieftain entered the clearing with his aide and signaled the start of the feast. James dug into the meal with gusto, noting that his Ingo meat tasted much better than the Ingo meat he had cooked earlier in the day. He mentally added leveling his cooking skill to his list of priorities, and then opened his menu to continue exploring the new information. James's inventory was somewhat lackluster, only containing a handful of Ingo skins and some common Ingo meat. His equipped items tab was much more interesting. Equipped items. Left hand, empty. Right hand, martyr skinning knife, widespread. Feet, cracked leather boots, widespread. Legs, dirty cloth pants, widespread. Chest, dirty cloth shirt, widespread. Shoulder, empty. Wrist, empty. Back, empty. Head, empty. Neck, necklace of lucidity, uncommon. Ring, 1 through 5, empty. Sheath, 1 and 2, empty. Bag, adventurous satchel, common. When James focused on the items, their stats appeared. His clothes gave him only 1 armor per piece. The necklace granted him 10 intelligence, and his bag did several things. Upon further inspection, James found that it had an infinite number of slots, but the items contained inside would drop if he died. The probability of any given item dropping depended on the rarity of the bag and the rarity of the item inside it. That must be why the bag had an unlimited number of slots, and why items didn't stack. Each item was at risk of being lost when he died. Each item had its slot and therefore its own probability of being dropped. The items inside didn't stack so that if he died, it was possible for him to only lose only a few of one particular item instead of the entire group of them. James focused on the 50% drop chance text next to the Necklace of Lucidity, and a chart appeared. The horizontal axis was labeled Item Rarity, and the vertical axis was labeled Bag Rarity. If you followed the rarity of an item along the chart until it intersected with the bag rarity, you got the drop rate of the said item. Widespread items, the most common, were gray. His adventurer's satchel was common, so that gave him a drop chance of 70% for widespread items, according to the chart. Common items were white, with a drop chance of 60%. Uncommon items were green, with a drop chance of 50%. Rare items were blue, with a drop chance of 40%. Purple extraordinary items had a drop rate of 30%, and legendary orange items had a drop rate of 20%. James noticed that each higher bag rarity level lowered the drop chance of all the things inside it by 10%. If he was to ever acquire a legendary bag, he would never drop any rare, extraordinary, or legendary items from it. Right now, though, he had a chance to lose anything in his inventory if he died. Do monsters follow the same drop rate rules? James didn't think the boss Ingo carried a bag, but maybe it did have its own drop chart. It's entirely possible that different monsters had different drop rates for items of each different rarity level. It didn't matter right now, but James added it to his mental list of questions anyway. After all, the people who ran the game told him everything would make sense eventually as long as he kept exploring and learning. James finished his meal and glanced around. Martyrs of all different sizes sat around tables with a massive fire in the center of them. The chieftain sat at a seemingly random table amidst the crowd. Most of the adult martyrs showed no sign of being satiated yet, so James resigned to playing the waiting game. If he remembered correctly from the last feast he witnessed, right before that crazy fight happened, no one had left the table, not even when they were all finished, so he wouldn't leave now. James focused on his menu and gestured to his final tab, Marks. Before he could read what was inside, he was lifted from his chair. Chapter 4. The Chieftain's Advisor. Frode sat at the right of Dreg, as was the martyr way. Most members of the race were left-handed, so it was customary for the chieftain's advisor to sit at the chieftain's right to protect his weak side. This tradition was as old as anyone could remember, but had been revived during the Exodus. The Oana who destroyed their homeland ambushed them at night quite often. The practice of protecting the chieftain's weak side soon became a necessity instead of an outdated formality once again. Frode idly wondered if anyone would have any announcements during the feast before he made one of his own. The Oana were getting frightfully close to their new village as of late, and the clan's priorities would have to change because of it. The villagers would not be happy, but they would do what was necessary. His race was wise, intelligent, and, most importantly of all, fearsome. He would make sure that the days of repopulation and farming did not make them forget that. It was high time they fortified their defenses and started to send war parties deeper into the Great Savannah. Dring prodded Frode with a quick elbow and pointed a hunk of meat at the man-cub. The boy sat next to Dring's cub and pawed at the air. Frode was aware of the stink bug problem around this time of day and often attempted to push the daily feast back a few hours to avoid the problem. Each time he talked Dring into agreeing, however, a villager or two would go missing, apparently driven mad by hunger. Scouts would find them later in a nearby Ingo nest, passed out and surrounded by bones. His race was undoubtedly wise and intelligent, but if they got too hungry, they were mostly just fearsome. Frode lovingly scoffed at his less refined brethren as he eyed the man-cub. His movements almost had a pattern to them. Suddenly, fear surged through Frode's body. His fur stood up and chills coursed through his body until his shoulders shuddered. He struggled to recall the teachings of his father. Among the shaman classes he learned as a child, Frode's father also spoke about the future. At the time, Frode dismissed the rantings as a side effect of his father having too much intelligence in a martyr body. After all, the clan revered his father for attaining levels of intelligence that none of his race ever could. Often, no one could understand the concepts of which he spoke. The memories came back in a sputtering stream as Frode called upon the innermost workings of his brain. His father spoke of a young man-cub who could walk when others could not, and who could customize his stats when he leveled while all the others had to wait until they reached maturity. The man-cub who could also command fire. Frode's fear leveled out when he remembered the last part. The man-cub was interesting indeed, but it was highly unlikely he could command fire. His rare shamanistic abilities allowed him some control over nature, but he was nowhere near being able to command it. Frode stood up and calmly walked over to the man-cub. Standing above him, Frode could see his hands moving in the same pattern every adult was familiar with. Children and cubs of every race got statistic points based on their actions, but none of them could manually place them. No one, no matter their race, gained access to the interface until they reached adulthood. Yet here this man-cub was, obviously navigating around his interface. It was time for Frode to investigate. Chapter 5. Abilities and Quests. Kicking and screaming, James was carried to the chieftain's hut and thrown inside. He was a little scared of the power of the creature that had so easily lifted and carried his thrashing body, but mostly he was just angry. "What the hell, man?" James exclaimed as he brushed the creases from his dirty cloth shirt. He felt awkward for a moment, speaking to the wizened old beast that way, but his anger soon made the moment pass. Frode motioned for James to take a seat on a pile of furs. James reluctantly did so. These furs were much softer and thicker than the furs in his tent. "My name is Frode. I am the advisor of the chieftain," Frode started. "Why'd you grab me?" James interrupted. "I would have happily followed you if you would have just asked." Frode thought on that for a second, letting the anger from being interrupted pass through him with a series of breaths. "My race used to live in a sprawling camp. It is what humans would call a city. A few years ago we were hunted down and slaughtered by the Oana. They destroyed our great city in the process. They killed many of our women, our elders, and even our children that day. They killed everyone except for us, the people you see in this camp. Our leader led us to safety and allowed us to rebuild here." James screwed up his face as if to say, "What's the fucking point?" "What I'm trying to say is that I apologize, man-cub. Your culture is different from ours. Some of these differences were born from a violent past, and might not be necessary these days. I would do well to remember that," Frode finished with a slight bow of his head. Taken aback by the old brute's self-awareness, James could only swallow his anger and nod. "I brought you here because I noticed you were poking around in your status tabs. I am sure you are aware, but only adults have access to their interfaces. It is a gift from the gods that children all around the world, except for you, do not receive." James was surprised that this NPC had access to the interface at all. Regardless of the reason that the programmers gave NPCs this access, James still thought it was smart to make them think it was a gift from the gods. James honestly wasn't sure how to respond. If he called the game what it was, he might be labeled crazy and would probably be smashed to a pulp. The pain James felt from just minor wounds was so real that the thought of a major one made him shudder. He wondered what would happen if he put all his stat points into will. Would he be able to stay conscious through major wounds? He decided he did not want to know the answer to that question and would rather pass out, even if he was in a life or death situation and he would lose his items. "What does that mean?" James asked, deciding to fish out what the NPC knew about the game. "I was hoping you could tell me. Where did you come from before you found Tarun being attacked by an Oana scout in the Great Savannah?" Crap, James thought. Some new, highly advanced artificial intelligence must power this NPC. Mulling over his options, James said the only thing he could think of that wouldn't break the game and get him fired. I don't know." "What do you mean you don't know?" Frode asked, sounding a lot like James's mother. "I have no memory from before that day. I am not even sure if James is my real name. In fact, I doubt it is. I simply woke up in the savannah and set out in a random direction to find answers. That is when I ran into Tarun," James lied. Frode sat back and stared at James for a long time before leaning forward and speaking softly. "I will help you get answers." The chieftain advisor paused again. "If you will help me with something." "Sure thing. Anything to get answers about who I am?" James said, wondering if he was laying it on a little too thick now. "It is getting dark out, and I am the only one in the village who can start fires. Freitas mentioned you had the ability to start them as well. If you can take over my fire duties, I will research your situation and look for answers." "Deal," James accepted as a notification popped up in his field of view. "Quest accepted. Take over Frode's duties of starting fires for the village." Frode continued to stare at James and eventually motioned to the door. James got the feeling that Frode had dismissed him moments ago, as he left the hut in a hurry. The chieftain was on his way in, and James smashed into his leg. James stared up at the massive chieftain, who let out a low growl which spurred James to his feet and far away from the hut. The villagers had finished their feast, so James set off to start the fires. He stopped by his tent first to stroke his, which still had lit embers from before his nap. Another pop-up appeared, and James sighed. Quest update. First day, 1 of 25 fires lit. This is going to be a long night. Scene break. For one of the few times in his life, James woke up from his peaceful slumber wholly enraged. His hands were still raw from starting 25 fires the previous night. The effort unlocked his XP bar, which was now 50% of the way to his next level. James thought that was pretty exciting, but it wasn't compelling enough to calm his anger. James untangled his body from his furs and resolved to either upgrade the furs he currently slept on or find a way to make an actual bed. His furs were quite comfortable, but the situation he just awoke to put him in a terrible mood. James had learned the hard way that when his life situation put him in a bad mood, the only way to improve his mood was to improve his life. Even if he couldn't change whatever put him in a lousy mood, improving other things, like his sleeping arrangement, would still help. Cock-a-doodle-doo! Still, James desperately wanted to improve those damn Ingos that kept waking him up. James briskly walked to his partner in crime's pile of furs. "Wake up, Tarun, we're going hunting again." Tarun stretched around in his pile as his ears perked up at the word hunt. As the two were about to leave the tent, an adult martyr reached out a massive hand and blocked their path. "James," Frey groggily began, "can you do me a favor?" "Sure," James replied, his sour mood temporarily soothed by Frey's voice. He was growing fond of the woman who had welcomed him to the village. She somehow exuded the love and care of a mother while remaining monstrous. Although he would probably never admit it, James had a weak spot for mother figures. He had been very close to his mother before she had died entirely too young. "Kill all the damn Ingos around the village," Prey finished as her heavy hand slumped to the floor and she fell back asleep. With that, James knew he was indeed a fan of the woman. Quest accepted. Hunt down and clear out 5 of the closest Ingo nests. The duo departed the tent and paused at the edge of the village. James glanced at Tarun and swore he had grown overnight. His muscles were slightly more pronounced, his skin seemed tighter around them, like he had lost a thin layer of baby fat. Either martyr cubs grew rather quickly or Tarun had leveled up the other day from the boss Ingo fight, James assumed. From what Frode told him the night prior, the level-up option made more sense. James nodded in approval at his game brother's growth and patted the portion of his waistband where he kept his martyr skinning knife. The 2 cubs set out into the great savannah. Alright guys, that is the end of my sample for tonight. Again, that was Martyrs, Legends of the Great Savannah by Justin Lincoln. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Also, I hope you have a good day, a good night, a good week, a good weekend, whatever time it is when you're watching this. Links for both of these books are going to be below this video. I will talk to you guys later.